to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin here with a huge week of World War III analysis. It is April 24th. We're entering the last week of April here in 2026 as we are well into the second month, almost even the third month of the U.S.-Iran war. Of course, the USS H.W. Bush has entered the CENTCOM area of responsibility. So as we've been predicting on the show, there is a solid chance that hot kinetic fire and bombing may erupt once again once the markets open up again on Monday or maybe at the end of the day on Sunday. The Israelis are openly requesting permission from the United States to begin strikes on Iran again. And in the midst of all of this, the ceasefire in Lebanon is not being held at all. Both sides are continuing to attack one another, Hezbollah and Israel, both sides taking losses and gains, whereas Trump is, despite all of it, announcing that the ceasefire will be extended another 3 weeks. So we're going to be discussing all of this, the situation in Russia and Ukraine, the situation in Iraq as the Kurds continue to be struck and no one seems to care. That's not a violation of the ceasefire at all, apparently. And of course, the latest, and by latest I mean today, trip that Abbas Araghchi took to Islamabad, Pakistan to meet with Pakistani officials there. Apparently, Trump desperately sent Witkoff and Kushner, his two court Jews who have been controlling the overseas situation for a long time now. He sent them in a desperate, quick flight to try to meet with Araghchi, but the Iranians officially stated that there are no plans to meet with those negotiators. And by the time that the Jews arrive in Islamabad, Araghchi will have already left Pakistan for Muscat, Oman, and after that he will be on to Moscow, Russia to, as he said, continue to coordinate with their regional allies. So negotiations seem to be over. The ceasefire has collapsed, and the Iranians have said they will not be negotiating as the U.S. blockade of Iran in the ocean continues. The blockade has been breached several times, despite the U.S. denying it. So we're going to be discussing all of that and so much more, as again, I predict that, I'm not saying I guarantee it will happen, but there's a solid chance that sometime during this week, the fighting will break out again if Trump realizes that his manipulations of the market and his word is no longer as effective in stopping the oil prices from climbing and other economic catastrophes from occurring. So we're going to be discussing all of that, church news, so much more, other fascinating World War III developments this week. But before we discuss that and some of the other content we've put out this week for your enjoyment, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing amazing, Conrad. Some fairly foul news taking place around the world. Market manipulations, diplomacy games being played by multiple countries at once, prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine. There is an ecological disaster taking place on the east coast of the Black Sea. And all of this in light of, again, Israel preparing to continue carrying out its genocide of both the Iranians and the Lebanese people. And of course, no doubt, the Palestinians thereafter. So again, the tensions are extremely high around the world as we're in this interesting post-Easter ceasefire state already for going into the third week. A very interesting week indeed, lots to discuss.
No, it is a big week of the roller coaster continuing to climb. And of course, it's already at a high level after weeks and weeks and weeks of fighting and thousands dead. And again, American casualty laundering continues. There have been weird adjustments to the casualty numbers that I'm sure, again, this thing is not over, so these numbers will not be final by any stretch of the imagination. But I want to remind everybody to check out our latest Ether Hour episodes this week. Yaqub Saraf, that's right, former defense minister of Lebanon, former governor of the Beirut governorate, and many other positions within the Lebanese power structure, joined us once again to discuss the ceasefire and the negotiations going on between Lebanon and Israel, the fighting going on, the resistance, and Hezbollah's fierce repulsion of the Zionist invaders. He discusses Iran and the Strait of Hormuz and what that's going to come to, as well as Turkey and Syria and his perspective on the prophecies of St. Paisios, the fall of Constantinople and the Turks, and sort of the Balkanization of Turkey and many other developments that I think would be very fascinating to any World War Now listener and really anyone in general. So get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co and check that out. It's going to be linked in the description below. Almost 2 hours of discussion, 50 plus minutes of the discussion are free. Of course, the full discussion available for everyone behind the paywall. So please, if you've been listening for a long time, consider supporting the show because, again, it takes a lot of hard work to keep everything going here. So please consider supporting. It's not too expensive. And again, it keeps the free show every week running just as much as it provides for the paid content that you all enjoy. So thank you so much for listening to that. Like this episode. That's right. If you're listening on Substack, YouTube, X, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you're listening, hit the like button, the thumbs up, whatever it may look like. And please leave a comment. Again, on all of those platforms, there are comment sections. Tell us what you think of the analysis. Give us your own analysis. We'd love to hear what you're thinking of World War III as these very fateful days unfold. But I think the first thing we have to talk about, of course, is the H.W. Bush, the USS George H.W. Bush, moving into the CENTCOM area of responsibility. They said on Thursday that it has arrived there in the Middle East, making it the third U.S. aircraft carrier in the region, amid growing signs that the very fragile U.S.-Iran ceasefire may collapse. Because again, Trump announced the extension of the ceasefire. The Iranians rejected that extension. So we're literally just on the rail here. It could go away at any time. There are no promises. There's no understanding. There's barely any communication going on between the two sides. So we are very much in uncharted territory here. CENTCOM posted on X, they said a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, USS George H.W. Bush, sails in the Indian Ocean on the U.S. Central Command Area of Responsibility, April 23rd. So that was very quick. The article goes on to say, notably, the Bush traveled to the region by sailing south of Africa, avoiding the Red Sea, signaling the U.S. is concerned the Houthis in Yemen could close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, though the aircraft carrier USS Gerald Ford is currently operating in the Red Sea. The other aircraft carrier in the region, the USS Abraham Lincoln, has been operating in the Arabian Sea from where U.S. warships are enforcing a blockade on Iranian ports. As CENTCOM announced the arrival of the Bush, President Trump issued a post on social media where he warned Iran that the clock is ticking and insisted that time was on his side. Iran's navy is lying at the bottom of the sea. Their air force is demolished. Their anti-aircraft and radar weaponry is gone. Their leaders are no longer with us. The blockade is airtight and strong, and from there it only gets worse. Time is not on their side, the president wrote. But of course, we know the Iranian navy of fast boats is very much operational. They have interdicted several ships. They have boarded and attacked several other boats, and they've even protected certain Iranian ships to evade the blockade. So the Iranian Navy is not gone. The Iranian Air Force is also not gone. They still have several F-4s, MiG-29s. They even might have some F-14s that they have from the last days of the Shah. So the idea that these entire branches of the Iranian military have been destroyed is very much incorrect. And we're going to obviously talk about the rumors of infighting and factionalism within Iran that are being ginned up by the media and Trump, which I think are largely being exaggerated. Before I hand it over to you, Dimitri, of course, the calls for the killing of specific Iranian leaders in the midst of that, those rumors about factionalism continue to spiral. Mark Thiessen, the same Washington Post neocon analyst that called for the negotiating team, Ghalibaf and Araghchi, their plane to be shot down as they were either flying to or from Pakistan for the negotiations. He's now calling for the killing of the hardline factions and allowing the supposed moderates to live so they could take over. But remember, supposedly, whether it was Ali Larijani, who was often rumored to be part of at least a more centrist faction, he was killed likely by Israel, the United States as well. But even other people, apparently there was a group of reformists who were killed by Israel in a strike. So the rumor is that Israel has been killing the potential successors to make sure the hardliners are in power so they can continue to fight Iran. And that's what the rumors are this week, that Israel is itching with their finger on the trigger to reignite attacks against Iran. So before we talk about Hezbollah, before we talk about anything else, Dimitri, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the blockade, on the ceasefire, what you think will happen this week now that the third aircraft carrier has arrived. Of course, the Houthis have still barely participated in this war, just a few missile launches at Israel, but the straits remain closed. Trump's attempts to play the economy seem to be having less and less of an effect on the market as it's finally starting to face the reality that the strait has basically been closed this entire time. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the Iranians are going to respond to this blockade that they have said is a no-go as far as negotiations go. So do you expect hostilities to break out this week? Do you expect there to be some kind of breakthrough? Do you expect Israel to intervene and ruin everything as usual? What do you think comes next here?
Well, I think, honestly, this week there's been clearly tensions already taking place again on the high seas, but in the Straits of Hormuz, amidst preparations for what may be Islamabad 2.0, we can almost call it. In a way, making an analogy to Ankara 1, Ankara 2, Istanbul 1 and 2, the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, which took place with the mediation of Turkey. But it's very clear that Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister of Iran, his visit to Muscat in Oman was perhaps for the preliminary preparations of additional talks with either the US or Israel, most likely with America, and again through the United States, with the state of Israel, most likely indirectly. However, his visitation to Moscow, I think, could be much more secretive in terms of the results of those meetings, similar to Ali Laranjani's visits in the past. Now, notice Ali Laranjani is no longer around, so Iran has lost one of those crucial diplomatic assets that it did have, this one professional who would travel all around the Middle East, who would travel again to Europe in order to discuss some of the specifics around Iranian long-term, I would say, macro militaristic strategy and geopolitical strategy related to the Middle East specifically, and defending his own country against Israel and America. Now, it's almost as if this role has been kind of hoisted upon Arakchi, as we anticipate will be successfully traveling to Moscow to meet with some of the higher officials. It will be very interesting if President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin will meet him personally, or if he will simply have a meeting with, for example, the Russian Prime Minister Mishustin, or perhaps just the Foreign Minister Lavrov. It will be very interesting to see what level of audience he is given. And I say this because there is some talks about potentially President Putin being again somehow reintegrated into the G20, Russia becoming again a holistic member of the international community, but also Russian diplomatic personnel such as Kirill Dmitriev being very cozy and warm in Washington, D.C. And, and again, what happened this year was somewhat unprecedented throughout the entire special military operation period. The 1 month of greenlit trade that Russia was allowed to have with its exportation, again, not harassed by America. Russia was essentially unsanctioned in terms of its crude oil exports this year. Again, those sanctions are now back in place after, of course, the commencement of April of this year. But it's very interesting to see exactly what Abbas Araghchi is preparing in Oman and exactly what he'll be discussing in Moscow. I doubt we'll have the full minute released of the talks that will take place with top Russian officials. But I think it'll be interesting to see exactly who he meets in Russia. I think that will determine as to the level of intensity as to Iran, the Iranian position and the intensity as to how Russia will respond to any future aggression against Iran. Will they discuss the Bushehr nuclear power plant, the ports on the north of Iran, the south of the Caspian Sea, all of these key strategic interests that Russia still has? Russia does not have too much of an interest in the actual Straits of Hormuz per se, because Russia has other shipping lanes, because it is in some ways a market competitor with Iran in terms of its raw energy exportation. But I think there are still strategic interests that Abbas Araghchi does want to secure here, because at this moment, the two nations really supporting Iran, whilst all the others have somewhat either taken a neutral or a negative position, is, of course, China and Russia. So I think those ties really need to be strengthened. And of course, we also understand the issues, aligning with Russia's support for Iran, given the previous complications in the Syrian theater during the Syrian civil war. I guess the failure of the Syrian special military operation, the Russian/Iranian expedition there, and of course the loss of the Bashar al-Assad regime. So it's not like there hasn't been previous failures at coordination between the two countries of Iran and Russia. Not to say that, you can't fail under pressure. Certainly you can, and that allowance is given. But what's really interesting, Conrad, again, is that Jared Kushner, Witkoff are the two sort of diplomats of America, the representatives of the United States, two members of Chabad Lubavitch, correctly put, being sent back to Islamabad to meet with whom exactly if Abbas Araghchi will not be there. Again, very interesting. How long will they stay in Pakistan? Typically, these visits last over the weekend, maybe 2 or 3 nights, and then they head back on their private jets. But if you recall, even in 2025, there were exactly 3 rounds of intense, almost face-to-face discussions between people like Abbas Araghchi and other diplomats from Iran, and specifically Steve Witkoff was present at all 3, and that's in round 1 in Muscat on the 12th of April 2025, in Rome, and again, Oman participated in that on the 19th of April 2025, and again, at Muscat in late April 2025. So exactly 1 year ago, we had Witkoff and Araghchi already in discussions. And then, of course, the June 12-day war occurred anyhow, right, in preparation for the next round. So just because there are premeditative talks and America is apparently going to sit down at the table with Iranian diplomats shortly does not mean a strike is somehow going to be put off for several weeks. Fortunately enough, I think Pakistan, it has successfully played a really powerful mediation role. They have had, some of the highest officials in the Pakistani political circles involved. So Pakistan is showing the utmost respect to the participants of the peace talks, which does give this, some sort of weight. I mean, if the Prime Minister and the head of the Pakistani military are both coordinating and both participating in these discussions, it shows that there's a level of respect, and that this country really does care for a peaceful resolution to I think, a situation which, again, may not even have a peaceful solution available to it. I mean, it's somewhat illusory, especially given at the moment what's taking place in the Straits of Hormuz. Not to say that Trump is not looking for potentially an off ramp. Some people are saying that Trump is trying to slowly off ramp the situation by announcing a sort of endless ceasefire between Iran and America, but at the same time claiming that if the green light is given, the American military, the American Air Force, and the Navy is prepared to again send Iran into the Stone Age, right? So essentially bomb Iran to smithereens at any point's notice. So at the moment, the blockade well and truly stands strong. Iran has attempted to defy that blockade. And this was perhaps the biggest point of tension, Conrad, this week was, of course, the USS Spruance, the Arleigh Burke destroyer. And these are massive, very, very powerful ships in the US Navy. They're about, I believe, anywhere between, we don't have the official numbers, but open sources are claiming there are between 5 and 8 of these USS destroyers positioned just on the Arabian Sea, essentially entrance towards the Straits of Hormuz to the east of Iran. And they are stopping any sort of unsolicited Iranian shipments from coming into Iran, but also bringing any goods out. And this particular ship, the Tuska ship that was entering along the coast of Oman, allegedly trying to make it to Bandar Abbas, a huge tonnage shipment vessel apparently carrying goods, importing them to Iran, was stopped by the USS Spruance. An American helicopter landed on board. Announcements were made. The ship was essentially taken over. And to this day, that's 5 to 6 days now, and probably as you're listening to the recording, it's been exactly a week. The Iranian commercial shipment vessel, the Tuska, is now in American custody. So in some ways, you can almost say the Americans were practicing these, and not just the Americans, but European powers as well, were essentially training on taking over some of these shadow vessels in other waters in all throughout 2026, in some ways preparing for this quasi-piracy raids. Iran has already announced that the takeover was a pirate-type takeover. It's not clear what exactly is on board. Some people around the Trump administration have speculated that, in fact, this ship was trying to bring in armaments from China, potentially military drones, things of that nature, or at least drone parts that could be later constructed within Iran. So it'll be very interesting if that data does come out. In my opinion, it's somewhat irrelevant. If China was attempting to send shipments of parts of drones to Iran, that's simply a commercial transaction between two sovereign states. There's really no issue there. I mean, the United States and Europe and NATO generally have been providing arms to Ukraine for the last 4 years. There's no real issue there. So in terms of hypocrisy and double standards, I think it's completely normal for Iran to be seeking some sort of material indulgence from its allied countries, such as China and Russia. There's no surprise there. So the Straits of Hormuz are, to this day, still locked up on both sides. The chains are put up almost like the chains around the Straits and the Bosphorus Dardanelles that were put up by the Byzantines during the defenses of Constantinople to prevent the various Viking raids. But just keep in mind, at this point, the Americans using these destroyers so actively in the Straits of Hormuz does open them up to potentially not just false flag operations, but does leave them open to any sort of Iranian counter operations. To this point, we haven't seen any U.S. ships officially hit, although there were claimed the Abraham Lincoln was struck earlier in the conflict over a month and a half ago. So, the potential is there. And one more thing I wanted to mention is there were reports of Iranian small boats actually mining the Straits of Hormuz in certain sections of it, and already the certain U.S. Media has responded and stated, yes, these mines are actually smart mines that can detect specific vessels, and they are operatable via GPS control. So these are very high-tech mines, much more nuanced than those we saw during the Second World War and during the Cold War. So these particular mines will take allegedly up to 6 months to remove. So you can notice Iran is already responding to the US's implicit and very express blockade of the Straits of Hormuz. And they're basically stating, look, if you guys aren't going to allow us to trade through our maritime means, we are simply going to make the Straits of Hormuz completely inhospitable waters. None of those commercial vessels in the Persian Gulf will be allowed to leave, except if they pay us $2 million American dollars worth in either yuan or allegedly, I think it was Bitcoin or some form of cryptocurrency, which is very interesting. So Iran at the moment is taking those payments as the ships pass by close to Bandar Abbas and they head out. So Iran controls this little toll gate area next to its coastline through the Straits. But the rest of the waters of the Straits potentially are now mined up, at least for the next 6 months. So this greatly complicates the commercial incentives for, world trade to, again, push forward and overcome these economic struggles. So Donald J. Trump's random tweets that make the Dow go up 1,000 points overnight and all these other market manipulations, they aren't actually based in reality. The tensions are extremely high in the Sea of Arabia. This is, as you said, Conrad, the third aircraft carrier has essentially arrived on theater after an entire month of training, doing air sorties. It carries with itself 3 additional destroyers that will arrive at the theater, which the numbers of destroyers will now rise well and truly over 12 at the very least in these particular waters. So the US Navy is in its, well, it's not in its full force at the moment, but it has been bolstered. And Pete Hegseth himself has said, he said, look, we can actually hold this blockade of less than 10% of the American naval might. So he at least claims that the blockade is going well, but we'll have to see what the official Iranian military response will be, because a lot of the people inside of Iran, at least the military, they're still incredibly hawkish towards America. They don't see diplomatic and ceasefire talks really going anywhere. And I think well and truly that they might be correct.
No, I think they are correct. And you mentioned the Pakistani negotiations. And ultimately, the reason Iran is even there is largely for respect for China. And, they want to obviously have a good relationship with Pakistan. It's a major border country that they share. Again, they share their alliance with China with, but ultimately Pakistan is far more aligned with the West and with international interests than Pakistan is. And this is from, I believe, the Financial Times, release posted by CIG. It says here, the reason why the Pakistani initiative to broker peace between Iran and the U.S. failed is because Pakistan didn't actually try to mediate between Tehran and Washington. They just pressed Iran to accommodate American and Israeli demands, which is simply unacceptable to the Iranians. Mistrust of Pakistan and Iran has only worsened when Israel launched the mass bombing campaign on Lebanon on April 8th, immediately after Pakistan announced it brokered a ceasefire, and Islamabad stayed silent on Israel's ceasefire violation, with Pakistani Commander-in-Chief Asim Munir and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar urging American officials in private, not in public, to restrain Israel. Moving forward, it is unlikely that a peace deal will be brokered by Pakistan and that Qatar and or Oman may become mediators in the future, as they are more impartial. And of course, as you said, Dimitri, Oman, Muscat will be Araghchi's destination after Islamabad. He may already even be headed there as this is being recorded. But there was some analysis from the Iranian side on this from Associate Professor of West Asian Studies at the University of Tehran, Dr. Hassan Ahmadian, who we are currently trying to work out getting on our show. He's a major Iranian analyst, Persian. He says after an initial round in Pakistan, Iran came out of the post-war negotiations with 3 conclusions. Washington does not view the war's outcomes realistically, nor does it build upon them in negotiations with Iran. 2, Washington emptied the negotiations of their substance after imposing the blockade and tried to change the terms of negotiation by doing so. 3, U.S. policy uses the blockade as a cover to prepare military and to surprise Iran for a 3rd time. However, Iran will not be taken by surprise militarily, nor will it negotiate except on the basis of the war's outcomes. And again, Qatar and Iran, I don't think anything's necessarily being worked out behind the scenes, but they obviously face some of the least amounts of strikes during the war. Maybe they'll even expel CENTCOM or something, make a deal with the Iranians and become, again, more like Oman, a true neutral player in the Middle East, which would be a massive victory for the Iranians in and of itself. So Qatar, Bahrain, some of these smaller Gulf monarchies are very much at risk of flipping either into Iranian sphere of influence or a neutrality that is far too dangerous for the U.S. as hegemon. But you also, of course, mentioned the market manipulation, everything that Trump has tried to do with all of his posts, the timing of his announcements. This is a X post. It says the scale of suspected insider trading around Trump's posts is staggering. $1.7 billion in oil futures traded in 2 minutes, just 3 hours before Trump announced the Iran ceasefire. $2 billion traded in 2 minutes, just 16 minutes before Trump posted about delaying Iran strikes. The CFTC has opened a formal investigation, but will it go anywhere? I'm very skeptical that that investigation would go anywhere, but it's just crazy to see that, as I've said a million times before, as things, continue to move forward and Trump either is preparing to take some kind of loss and spin it as a win or drag us into a true worldwide conflict where all of the parties are dragged in kinetically. They're trying to extract as much wealth out of the massively bloated market and the crazy stock nonsense as they can before things go a certain way. And of course, as I said, Israel is itching to renew the war against Iran. Israel Katz, Israeli defense minister, said Israel was waiting for a green light from the United States, first and foremost, to complete the elimination of the Khamenei dynasty, the initiator of the extermination plan against Israel and the successors of the leadership of the Iranian terror regime, and in addition to return Iran to the age of darkness and stone by blowing up central energy and electricity facilities and crushing national economic infrastructure. He added that the renewed bombing campaign will be different and deadly and will add devastating blows in the most painful places, following the enormous blows the Iranian terror regime has already suffered so far that will shake and collapse its foundations. The threat from Katz comes on the same day that President Trump amplified calls to kill Iranian leaders who won't accept U.S. demands for a deal. Katz's rhetoric also echoes President Trump, who has previously threatened to send Iran back to the Stone Age by destroying all of its power plants. Trump has also threatened to unleash hell on Iran, blow up the entire country, and at one point said an entire civilization would die if he escalated the bombing campaign. And this is from Tabs, along with all of the Israelis, the Israeli dog trying to break free from the leash that Trump has at least momentarily imposed upon it. Again, I'm very skeptical of the idea that Trump has quote unquote restrained Israel. I think it is theater. And I think, again, Israel, the reason they've accepted the quote unquote ceasefire in Lebanon and stopped their immediate ground advances is because they were taking so many losses. The Iranian missile situation was becoming hard to cover up in the media. And again, the vision of Israel as the safe haven for world Jewry and international Jewry is important. They can't have all the Jews just leaving and fleeing back to their cozy coastal condos in the West. They need, the Jewish state needs to be a place that is desirable for Jews, very cowardly people that have no interest in actually, fighting or, standing for something they believe in. No, it has to be very easy. The settlers are all protected by the military. They're not actually interested in even a fair military confrontation with the Palestinians. So that's what's going on there. And I think that very much is allowing Israel to seem as if, we'll allow it to look like this goyim, this idiot Trump is, restraining us. But in reality, they are reassessing, they are rebuilding, rearming, and preparing for the next phase, which will probably be even bigger than what we've witnessed so far. But it says here, U.S. military officials are preparing new contingency plans in case the ceasefire with Iran collapses, with a strong focus on operations around the Strait of Hormuz, CNN reports. The plans emphasize dynamic targeting of Iran's capabilities in the Strait of Hormuz, the Southern Arabian Gulf, and the Gulf of Oman, including potential strikes on fast attack boats, mine-laying vessels, and other asymmetric assets that Tehran has used to disrupt shipping and exert pressure on the U.S. Unlike earlier phases of the conflict, which targeted sites deeper inside Iran, these new options would involve a more concentrated campaign around key maritime choke points. However, officials caution that strikes alone are unlikely to immediately reopen the waterway. Additional options under consideration include strikes on dual-use infrastructure, such as energy facilities, to force Iran back to negotiations, as well as targeting individual Iranian military leaders and other obstructionists within the government, who U.S. officials have recently suggested are actively undermining negotiations. Renewed U.S. strikes would likely also target remaining missile systems launchers and production sites that were not destroyed in previous U.S.-Israeli strikes or have since been relocated. As one source familiar with the military planning put it, unless you can unequivocally prove that 100% of Iran's military capability is destroyed, it will come down to how badly Trump is willing to accept the risk and start pushing ships through the strait. So it's clear that the Strait of Hormuz being reopened is no simple military operation. Of course, it talks, Dmitry, you mentioned the mines being laid in the strait. These small boats are very capable of laying mines and escaping undetected. And Yaqub Saraf, again, encouraging everyone to listen to our Ether Hour episode with him this week, linked down below, episode 116. Former Defense Minister Yaqub Saraf explained how one of the reasons why Trump is acting so bizarrely angry and is pushing so hard about getting the UK and France and the rest of NATO involved in this operation. One is obviously just to deflect blame and to bring the whole world into this conflict and not make it realize it's just the Zionist puppet that is the United States acting genocidally on behalf of Israel. But they need the French and British minesweepers that America just doesn't have. They don't have the real capabilities for it. America's never had to really deal with comprehensive mine recovery operations, considering we are again separated by two massive oceans, whereas the British and the French, over the years, even in conflicts before, the Middle East was the main theater of conflict with the North Sea and the English Channel and these other places that are very easily mineable. So apparently that is something that is really frustrating Trump, even the strategic people behind the scenes. And we know that one of those U.S. minesweepers was supposedly in the region, was actually just somewhere off the coast of, I think, Thailand or Malaysia. One of the sailors on there was scratched by a monkey and had to be taken to his other base. So again, instead of actually removing the mines, our minesweepers are in Southeast Asia facilitating our troops, fraternizing with ladyboys and getting attacked by monkeys. So that's what's really going on. And that's why apparently Trump is so angry at NATO for not helping us specifically on the minesweeping operations. And it's true, every time he references Europe, he's like, they haven't helped us on the Strait of Hormuz. They need to help us on the Strait. They need to help us reopen the Strait, which generally means joining the war. But I think in more particular terms, he literally needs them to get in there and remove these mines and help us, as what I just read from CNN, literally start forcing our way through the straits and sort of diffuse blame across the international community so we can prevent what appears to be a fast approaching economic disaster. Again, air defense was activated in Iran a few times this week. Once was apparently to shoot down a few enemy small quadcopter drones that had been launched by clandestine Mossad groups within Iran. But sometimes they were just operated as a false alarm or were just being tested. But Brent crude at one point shot up 5%, so almost $5, because it's now over $100, but shot up 5% just when the rumors and the reports of the air defense being activated started. So everything is contingent upon supposedly this promise from the U.S. to open up the straits again as fast as possible. But it becomes clearer and clearer that the Iranians are very much in full control. But of course, Dimitri, you mentioned the different leadership in Iran and, some of the supposed infighting that's going on. Of course, Mojtaba Khamenei supposedly told Arakchi and has given an order directly that no negotiations with the United States can be undertaken at this time because of the blockade. That's why Arakchi would just be giving a statement to the Pakistanis on the situation and not engaging in any kind of direct discussion with the Iranians. Of course, the U.S. was stoking the narrative that Ghalibaf was the emergent real negotiator and that it was potentially a rift between him and Pezeshkian versus the IRGC and the supreme leader. But none of this really makes sense. You maybe could have said Larijani and Pezeshkian and Arakchi were one faction and all of that. But remember, Ghalibaf himself is directly connected to the IRGC. He flew to Lebanon in 2024 and was openly advocating for the Iranian support of Hezbollah. And of course, Mojtaba Khamenei is widely understood to have been the IRGC's man to be supreme leader. So between Ahmad Vahidi, who is the current IRGC commander who replaced the one who was assassinated at the beginning of the war, considered also very much a hardliner, as well as Mohsen Rezea, former IRGC commander, current, I think the main military advisor to the supreme leader himself, they wanted Mojtaba Khamenei in there. There are rumors that he is somehow disfigured, that he's lost a leg, that he has a lot of other issues. We have no idea if that's true at all. I would wait for Iranian confirmation there. But the idea that there is this infighting is obviously something that is being pushed. I think it's sort of wish casting and trying to meme it into existence. The Trump administration, I think they think if they say that there is a reformist party that wants to negotiate, that suddenly that party will emerge and communicate. And that's obviously part of why they likely left Pezeshkian alive. They saw him as potentially that character. But it says here, Iran President Masoud Pezeshkian and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf have rejected claims by U.S. President Donald Trump that there's an internal infighting within Iran's leadership. Pezeshkian said there are no hardliners or moderates in Iran. We are all Iranians and revolutionaries. The iron unity of the nation and the state and full obedience to the supreme leader, we will make the criminal aggressor regret its actions. He added, one God, one nation, one leader, and one path, victory for Iran dearer than life. Ghalibaf reposted the same message on his account on X. Trump had earlier claimed there was a crazy internal conflict in Iran between rival factions within the leadership. Writing on his Truth Social platform, he said Iran is having a very hard time figuring out who their leader is. They just don't know. The infighting is between the hardliners who have been losing badly on the battlefield and the moderates who are not very moderate at all, but gaining respect is crazy. And I would be willing to say that I'm sure there is perhaps a small disconnect between the actual negotiating team and maybe the military IRGC itself in a very practical, geographic sort of way that there might have led to some miscommunication. But to me, it's very clear that every factor, every player is ultimately loyal to the supreme leader here. And the idea that there would somehow be some big split or uprising is just not possible. Even if some of these people are scumbags behind the scenes and are playing a long game, there's clearly just no immediate recipe for a political leader to lead somehow an uprising and then take power. Like, that's why Trump has been posting more and more of this Reza Pahlavi stuff. There's been more news about him. He's been getting more news appearances. He had hot sauce thrown on him recently, and now after the hot sauce was thrown on him, he now has to be behind 10 inches of bulletproof glass every time he speaks. So this guy is a total clown, but we are seeing more Kurdish things occurring. But we did have a very recent statement as we were recording this from Iran's defense ministry spokesperson, Brigadier General Reza Taleghani, who says that a significant portion of Iran's missile capability has not been used. The armed forces has full control over the skies and the occupied territories, and did so up until the moment before the ceasefire. The massive presence of the people in the streets, even after the ceasefire, was a social miracle. Over 30 million people have registered in the Sacrifice campaign. This is an unparalleled example of our popular mobilization in the world. The enemy sought to create chaos and insecurity inside the country, but thanks to the vigilance of the people and the efforts of law enforcement forces, the Basij, and security organizations, the country remains in a secure, stable, and cohesive condition. The Strait of Hormuz is under Iran's wise and powerful management and has become a control lever for realizing the demands of the Iranian nation. So much so that enemy forces in the Sea of Oman have repeatedly retreated in the face of the decisive response of the armed forces. So, between the Foreign Ministry and the IRGC and the Defense Department of Iran, it seems that everyone is very much on the same page. And you mentioned, of course, Dimitri, the visit to Russia. Who exactly will Araghchi be meeting with? I'm sure there will be messages relayed from Putin to the supreme leader, whether or not Putin meets directly with Khamenei or not. But on top of their involvement with the Russians, the Iranians have, like I said earlier, have been continuing to strike Iraqi Kurdistan on the region there, as they have been training and militants have been amassing in certain areas, which again, the Iranians have obviously been aware of the U.S.-Israeli attempt to amass Kurds to invade and lead revolutions in Iran since January, when the protests were going on, and Turkey shared intelligence with the Iranians to prevent this from happening. But Ron Prosor, the Israeli ambassador to Germany, in the past few days met with representatives of the Iranian Kurds and other support that interact with the Iraqi Kurds at the Israeli embassy in Berlin. So clearly there's more and more cooperation occurring in that regard. And it says the Kurdistan regional government has rejected Iranian claims that foreign intelligence services operate on its territory following Tehran's execution of 2 men accused of contacting the Israeli intelligence service, Mossad, in Iraqi Kurdistan. The KRGC hosts no foreign intelligence facilities or training centers. Such claims risk undermining the stability of the Kurdistan region that the Kurdistan region has consistently sought to preserve, which again is ridiculous considering that the only American bases still in Iraq are the ones in Erbil. And they were getting struck up until the very end there. And it's clear that the Americans have no cards to play when it comes to stopping the Iranians from striking troops amassing on their border in these Kurdish regions. But the other main update that I think is going to be a developing story, because the U.S. has attempted to interfere, I think, and change this. But regarding Iraq, it says the Iraqi Coordination Framework, which is the kind of body that decides the political establishment in Iraq, because they still haven't really been given a fully functional, normal, quote-unquote democratic government. They have selected Bassem al-Badri to be the candidate for prime minister. Nur al-Maliki withdrew and endorsed him. Local reports indicate that al-Badri was also endorsed by Iran during Ismail Khani's visit. This was when one of the spokespeople and deputy foreign ministers of Iran visited Iraq. And I think this person ended up being selected, Bassem al-Badri. Either he is the candidate or, they've been attempting to delay it. But it seems there's a high likelihood that the Shia pro-Iran aligned candidate will become prime minister in Iraq, fully cementing not just the Iranians driving out U.S. soldiers from Iraq, but also a sort of political replacement as well. But one other thing before I hand it over to Dimitri that was interesting coming out of Iran was there were some opinion polls conducted within Iran on the people's opinions on the war. This is a reporter from Middle East Spectator. This was all from Iranian state TV, IRIB. It says, opinion poll conducted in Iran, and this is whether they approve or disapprove. The issue 1 being limiting Iran's missile program, 85.7% disapprove. A total halt to uranium enrichment to end the war, 79.4% disapprove. The free passage through the Strait of Hormuz as a condition to end the war, 73.7% disapprove. Abandoning the resistance axis for an end of the war, 68.1% disapprove. There was another one. It said, to what extent do you agree with ongoing negotiations with the United States? 39% said not at all, meaning they're completely opposed to any negotiations. 8.6% said they agree very little with the negotiations. 16.6% said they somewhat agree with negotiations. 19.1% say they agree with them a lot. And 10.4% say very much. So 64.2% of people mostly oppose negotiations, with 29.5% in Iran being in favor. The poll goes on to say that 66% of Iranians consider Iran to be the winner of this war. 87.2% of Iranians were satisfied with the armed forces' response, and 57.7% believe that the U.S. is more in need of a ceasefire than Iran. And look, I'm sure these numbers might be fudged slightly, but I'd say that seems largely accurate based on the street protests, the sheer lack of armed resistance or attempt to disrupt the military activities and, seize a potential power vacuum. I would say those statistics seem largely accurate. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of that, Dimitri, the situation in Iraq as well, before we transition to Lebanon.
Yeah, no, very interesting analysis. The various sensi and the sociological studies, touching on what the Iranian people actually feel, because at the moment, the Trump administration and other Western liberal, and I mean Western in like the negative sense, clearly globalist controlled media sources are putting out this idea that it was in fact 30,000 Iranians that died early in 2026 during the protests that took place. So that particular fake news narrative is still being widespread. So they're allegedly saying that obviously the Iranian population is heavily repressed. They're repressed by the sort of three major groups controlling Iran. Well, generally under the umbrella of the IRGC, that is, of course, the besieged militia of radicalized, I mean, they call themselves the Army of the 20 million, the IRGC, and then, of course, the more specialized Quds Force, which is being described as like some sort of like SS stormtroopers, like the Russian equivalent of the GRU. But just for some of the new listeners, perhaps still not informed perhaps on the names of these particular groups within Iran, the IRGC, as we mentioned before, around 200,000 person strong, specialized, militarized force that is very, I would say, religiously zealous in terms of their Shia Islamic faith. They have a direct link to the supreme leader himself, Mujtaba Khamenei. Specifically, Mujtaba Khamenei himself, Conrad, as you said correctly, he literally served in the IRGC in the Iran-Iraq War in 1987. And mind you, the war ended in 1989, so he served towards the later end of that. And he's now the supreme leader. The New York Times actually released an article this week which stated that allegedly Khamenei is still undergoing operations, medical treatment. Perhaps he will require some prosthetic limbs due to the Eve of Purim attack that took place on the 28th of February, now this almost 2 months ago. And apparently the president, Masoud Pezeshkian, given he is a surgeon and a doctor himself, is apparently personally, as well as the best surgeons from the Ministry of Health of Iran, are carrying out his treatment at most likely an undisclosed location in the hospital. But the New York Times article also mentioned very interestingly that apparently some of the maybe mid-range Iranian politicians are a little bit afraid of meeting with Mujtaba Khamenei or even visiting him in hospital only because they're afraid the US or Israel may strike his location at any time. I'm not saying these fears are alleviated. I think they're very real given the assassin-like qualities of this Talmudic coalition that has essentially put itself against Iran in this particular conflict. So, in fact, yes, Khamenei, I think, continues to be a target. But yes, he absolutely is an IRGC guy. He supported this revolutionary core from the very beginning. He is part of this group. His father, of course, served in the Iran-Iraq war. These people have been involved from the very start. Even, of course, Ghalibaf himself, like he served in the Iran-Iraq war as a member of the IRGC for even longer than Mujtaba Khamenei has. And yes, Ghalibaf being a mayor of Tehran at some point and holding all these other senior positions, he may come off as just your standard Vyacheslav Volodin type Speaker of the Parliament, just a person in a high political position, maybe like a Dr. Pezeshkian, but he's in fact a former military guy. He is Russian sense, he's like a former President Putin, Patrushev military, a man with military expertise, a man who's most likely been somewhat involved with the Quds Force, and that's one of the other definitions. So for those interested, the Quds Force could be maybe described as a mixture between the CIA and the American Delta Force, so the Russian military intelligence, the GRU. They are very specialized, most likely no more than 100,000 personnel in this particular group. It's very tight-knit. They're very basically the Iranian equivalent of a militarized version of Mossad, so very powerful. And of course, they operate throughout the entire Middle East, setting up all these various proxies and defense groups in order to protect their own country from Israel. So when you think about which group necessarily directly opposes Mossad in this geopolitical regional tension theater, most likely it would be that Quds Force. And of course, the besieged is more like the widespread militia involvement of just general people, reservists, conscripts who don't want to join the regular Iranian military, which is also large, but mind you, it's at least 1 million personnel strong. They would then join or enlist in the besieged militia forces, which probably aren't as well trained as your regular 200,000 strong IRGC personnel corps, but at least they do have that, I would say, investment in the health and well-being of the supreme leader. And again, pushing this idea that the Iranian state is there to protect all Shia Muslims throughout the Middle East. So it's a very, I would say, not a very ancient idea, quite novel, but it is reflective of, I mean, it is defensive in nature, first and foremost. Their main goal is to defend Shia Muslims and their Sunni Muslim allies against the aggression of Israel and other, what they call imperial European states, which, again, America now, unfortunately, has also marked itself as a member of. So very interesting sort of power disparity within Iran. But mentioning that disparity, like there are different structures within Iran, but at this point, Conrad, there's no need for all these various American media sources to even try to create a rift in Iran itself. Yes, surely there are politicians who are more dovish and some who are more hawkish, but at this point, the two most, shall we say, neutral to, shall we say, perhaps dovish politicians that have caught our eye and who we've discussed since at least late 2024, Dr. Pezeshkian and Anna Abbas Arakchi have taken a very patriotic position. Just for reference, Mustafa Khamenei actually supported President Ahmadinejad early in the early 2000s. And if you recall his hyper anti-Zionist, anti-Israeli statements, I mean, these people are very much motivated. At the moment, there's no inclination, there's no evidence we have at all, or there's no facts that would point towards Mustafa Khamenei taking a dovish position, especially if you consider direct members of his family being killed by Israel and America. No. So clearly there isn't a rift within Iran. And if there is one, it's not coming out from any of those figures we mentioned recently, especially given their behaviors from the beginning of the Purim War itself. And, as we mentioned, the theater of Iran, the Straits of Hormuz, the intensity is still on. There are still 50,000 American personnel. There are still the expeditionary forces, the aerial American commando forces located somewhere, most likely in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, prepared to make those strikes on the islands whenever Trump or Netanyahu or whomever is in command, the learned elders of Zion give them the green light to actually do so. American lives will be put at risk. There are, of course, 3 USS destroyers, the Mason, the Donald Cook, and the Ross, traveling alongside the George H.W. Bush as they traverse all around Africa, 11.5 thousand miles, whilst carrying out aerial sorties and training. And of course, with them, they carry 2 refueling crafts as well, which are very high speed. In fact, the American Navy only has 2 of these fast oil refuelers, the USNS Arctic and the USNS Supply. These are very fast-traveling supply boats. And again, the American Navy, in a way, this is its last hurrah. If it doesn't manage this Operation Epic Fury, Conrad, if this is a failure, if Trump chooses the off-ramp, not only will this bring down the Republican Party in terms of its reputation, I think, domestically in America, it will also point towards a clear militaristic maritime decline of American prestige around the world. And unfortunately so, this had to be done under the auspices and under the pretext of supporting Israel. I mean, this is a huge, I would say, chapter of shame for in American military history, probably worse than the American Civil War if this is carried out. And to be fair, it will go bad either way. If America continues the war against Iran, it will end very badly for America in the long term because American personnel will die. There will be no doubt American hardware will be damaged, and maybe even some sort of domestic tensions within the US will be carried out. But also, if America pulls out, no doubt the reputational damage will be there for the long term. And who knows, America itself domestically will probably, after the midterms, and who knows, the next election will descend into a never-ending slippery slope of Democrat rule, which will further degenerate, American Christian culture to something which will become unrecognizable. So all of these motions were set into play by Trump essentially carrying out this operation at the beginning of Purim this year. This is how bad things really are. We don't want to sugarcoat it at all. And it is incredibly tragic that, we stand sort of on the precipice of a third world war. And we are really in a third world war, but it will become very hot in the Middle East on behalf of the Israeli regime of Netanyahu, who at this point is entirely unapologetic. So it's all very scary. And at the same time, we do have this constant threat of Iran again choosing to, because Iran has been somewhat on the back foot in terms of they've been very responsive and reactive to the US, but eventually Iran will be carrying out operations unilaterally just themselves, choosing to take motions. And I think this week kind of showed that because Iran actually straight up seized 2 commercial vessels in the Straits of Hormuz, the MSC Francesca, which was apparently somehow linked to Israel, and the Epimenides, which was a Liberian-flagged cargo ship. So apparently it was African in origin, but most likely these 2 ships, the Francesca and the Epimenides, were apparently trying to breach the blockade of Iran firstly before reaching the American blockade, which probably would have let them through, given they do fly flags which aren't Iranian. But most interestingly, who knows, these ships were not interested in paying the $2 million worth of yuan to the Iranian regime. So it is very interesting how no matter what way the Americans really try to push this particular issue, it does look like there will need to be a fall guy. Will it be Pete Hegseth? I don't think it will be J.D. Vance, and we'll speak about him, I think, later on in the show, but it's a very interesting figure. But notice how J.D. Vance, Conrad, he's been somewhat sidelined. They've kind of allowed him to keep his hands clean, Pontius Pilate style, in a way, whilst people like Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, and Donald J. Trump are almost taking the, I would say, reputational fall for all of these huge and insane actions being carried out in the Middle East. And I think, sadly, the slaughter of Iranians is only somewhat overshadowed by the insane actions being taken by Israel against the Lebanese people. And to this day, I just want to cover some of the general statistics in Lebanon, just so people can appreciate, yes, there's been at least 3,000 Iranians killed during the Purim War these last 2 months, but there's also been, since the beginning of the war against Hezbollah by Israel, there's been a killing of at least 2,490 Lebanese civilians and 7,700 injured. And those injuries are most likely given the Ministry of Health has actually, the Lebanese official Ministry of Health, the government department has passed on these statistics to us. These aren't coming from so-called paramilitary terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, as the Western media likes to portray. No, these are coming from the official, you can say almost neutral in Israel, ministry from Lebanon. And if these injuries means that people have actually been attending hospital, they've been attending some sort of medical treatment. The hospitals all over Lebanon, no doubt, are full. The paramedics are probably working overtime. The ambulances are most likely constantly, refueling. It's absolutely insane, especially south of Lebanon, given the bombing of the Israelis of the Litani River bridges. There are huge logistical and infrastructural damages being done just to the general Lebanese population as the war obviously continues. And as you said earlier, Conrad, there's most likely the ceasefire was in fact a favor for Israel being given by Donald J. Trump by extending the ceasefire by 3 months between Israel and Lebanon. Yes, it is a shaky ceasefire, but most likely it's to hide amidst the fog of war. Let the Israelis regroup. Let them perhaps prepare for the inevitable siege of Bint Jbeil, which they've already surrounded. And apparently there's been a bombing of this particular town on the Israeli-Lebanese border. Bint Jbeil has been surrounded, and unfortunately there have been civilian deaths throughout the week. So fortunately enough, this week there have been less deaths than in the previous week, and obviously the 8th of April, the Black Wednesday, as they like to call it, the deadliest day of bombing, I think, in the entire Middle East. You can almost say over 350 people at this point. Most likely that number continues to climb. The statistics keep getting updated when Israel carried out these absolutely inhumane bombings on the same day that Judas decided to betray Christ to the Sanhedrin. Very symbolic, of course, for 30 silver pieces, which we know Talmudically some of the Talmudic tribe members in the Pale of Settlement used to sell. For example, used to purchase children from very poor or rundown Russian, Ukrainian families specifically for 30 silver pieces. So the whole symbolism of Israel carrying out these bloodthirsty strikes on the 8th of April, specifically on Great and Holy Wednesday before Orthodox Christian Easter, is not something that, of course, escapes our analysis. We have to keep in mind most of what these people do is always in the frame of their religious worldviews and some of these other occult meanings that they, of course, try to carry out their very worldly and very satanic actions in the guise of or behind, they try to carry out certain traditions of their own. And I do want to mention, Conrad, the sad killing of that female Lebanese journalist, Amal Khalil, who was killed with 4 of her colleagues at Tiri. And this particular journalist, you can see footage of her. She was clearly not holding no weapons whatsoever. She had press clearly over her helmet. The Israelis, and this is interesting because when she was killed shortly thereafter, the Lebanese Ministry of Health, again, an official institution within Lebanon that isn't anti-Semitic at all, you can almost say, because we know the Lebanese departments are very well and truly somewhat neutral in this particular conflict. They openly stated that Israel was apparently manhunting her specifically because, apparently maybe she was putting forward certain perspectives which were anti-Zionist, which were anti-Israeli. Perhaps she was personally, again, against the invasion of her own country, and she was covering it as a war correspondent, a very brave young lady on the front lines. And yeah, this young lady, Miss Khalil, was murdered by an Israeli long-range bombing, most likely from an Israeli Lockheed Martin plane, which was paid entirely by American taxpayer dollars. I mean, how evil can you really get? And this is only one case study, unfortunately. Her name, hopefully, among the Lebanese populations will not simply become another statistic, but yes, as the war continues, this will be one of most likely many casualties that Israel will inflict upon another victim country that they're currently, again, attacking like a vampire attacks its victims.
No, it's really disgusting. And you mentioned Emil Khalil. Al Jazeera reporter Heidi Petch, she reported that Khalil had received threats from multiple Israeli WhatsApp numbers during the last war, warning her to stop her reporting or leave Lebanon if she wanted to keep her head on her shoulders. She was killed in an airstrike, and apparently the rescue crew to dig her out of the rubble couldn't reach the strike site for 6+ hours because the Israelis were pinning them down and were preventing the clearing of the roads in the area for rescuers to arrive. So I wouldn't be surprised if this was specific IDF commanders taking out someone that they had personal vendetta against for their honest journalism and reporting on this. So pray for the reposed soul of Emil Khalil. And again, it shows you that, look, in America, journalism and journalists are genuinely and generally people that I dislike and have a disdain for and are liars that work for Zionist Jewish interests. But those covering the war in southern Lebanon, and especially those like our friend Zainab al-Safar, people that work for Al-Akbar, Al-Mayadeen Media, the resistance-aligned media, and even Al Jazeera and other groups that are fairly neutral when it comes to the Lebanon conflicts, they are very much targeted because dissenting voices and breaking the Jewish monopoly on the press is something that deeply, deeply offends them. And for Jews, the information war is no different than the info war. And I think it's time that the Goyim start realizing that. And one, that would mean removing the hostile entities that is the Jewish-run media in the West, in the United States and Europe. But again, realizing that the Jews are going to come for you as a quote-unquote anti-Semite or a stochastic terrorist, just as much as they're going to come after Hezbollah or IRGC people who, at least many Americans have been convinced are quote-unquote actual terrorists. But to the Jews, it's all just goyim to them. So, and if you're not fully Zionist, then you are a threat to the existence of their greater Israel project. But this is from Jason Ditz at Anti-War. The headline, 3 more killed in Israeli strikes as U.S. says Lebanon ceasefire extended 3 weeks. The 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon has been extended for another 3 weeks, according to President Trump, who said high-profile meetings in the Oval Office went very well and ended with a plan for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Lebanese President Joseph Aoun to meet in the coming weeks. Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar insisted that Israel and Lebanon have no serious disagreements, and it is only the existence of Hezbollah that remains as an obstacle to normalized relations. He urged Lebanon to cooperate with Israel on disarming Hezbollah. In the meantime, Israel will continue its occupation of southern Lebanon and its systematic destruction of dozens of towns and villages south of the Yellow Line, which Israel established at the beginning of the previous ceasefire. Over the course of the 10-day ceasefire that this new deal extends, Israel continues to conduct offensive operations, and indeed today they once again killed 3 people in airstrikes against the southern village of Yatir. 2 others were also wounded, including a child. The IDF claimed all 3 were slain were Hezbollah operatives and that they were trying to shoot down the drone. Yes, these 2 children were Hezbollah operatives. Before the drone ended up killing the whole group of them, they provided no evidence to support the claim, however, and none of the slain have yet been identified. Lebanese officials have yet to identify and address the ceasefire extension nor comment on the planned Aoun-Netanyahu meeting. President Trump suggested his intention was to work with Lebanon to help them against Hezbollah, however. That once again suggests that the ceasefire isn't actually intended to cease any fire. Hezbollah, who was not included in the talks and did not endorse the ceasefire, is going to continue to be targeted by a growing number of belligerent factions. Increasingly, however, targeting Hezbollah has meant targeting Lebanon's broader Shiite population, particularly in the south, where they've been broadly expelled from their homes, which are in the process of being destroyed by Israel on national security grounds. With 20% of Lebanon's population presently displaced by the war, it is unlikely that this latest extension will change much, and so far the general recommendation from all participants in the talks is that they hold off on returning to their homes for the time being, irrespective of if those homes still exist or in the process of being leveled. And Lebanese Prime Minister Nawaf Salam, he said, "We urge the Trump administration to pressure Israel to reduce its demands and end its invasion of the country. Lebanon cannot sign any agreement that does not include a full withdrawal of Israeli forces. We cannot coexist with the so-called buffer zone, where displaced people are not allowed to return to their cities and villages." And again, Nawaf Salam has had no shame in calling for the disarmament and destruction of Hezbollah, but he has to remember that technically he is the prime minister of a coalition of which the second largest party in its government is Hezbollah and its bloc. So he has to, at some capacity, appeal to his Shia constituencies, but of course, the Yellow Line was mentioned. Hezbollah released a statement and said, "We will bring down the so-called Yellow Line and we reject direct negotiations with the enemy." And in general, there's a lot of people in Lebanon that don't consider negotiations between Joseph Ayoun, who again pretty much only represents the Lebanese Forces Party and the Maronites and other Sunni factions that are in favor of reuniting and recognizing Israel. Many people, like obviously Hezbollah and other parties, Shia and Orthodox, are going to be against all of that. So, of course, the article mentioned the mass looting of occupied southern Lebanon. This says here, south of the newly established Yellow Line, Israel has established de facto military occupation of over 50 Lebanese municipalities and has been demolishing homes and preventing the return of displaced locals. The destruction goes deeper than that, however. A new report from Israel's Haaretz quotes numerous Israeli soldiers within southern Lebanon saying that the looting of civilian property from homes in the area has become widespread and routine, and that commanders are making no serious effort to try to prevent it. Soldiers cited troops taking motorcycles, televisions, and even sofas out of private homes and loading them on military vehicles and bringing them back across the border into Israel. Everyone sees it and understands it, one quoted was saying. Though the IDF responded to the Haaretz report by claiming that it conducts inspections at the border and takes disciplinary action when necessary, the soldiers suggested that virtually never happens. Indeed, only some of the border crossings even have checkpoints in which to inspect looted cargo in the first place. At most, some commanders told their soldiers to stop looting, but have taken no action to really enforce that order. Others simply let it go. When there is no punishment, the message is obvious, one of the soldiers added. Another said he thought if military police jailed anyone for the looting, it would stop pretty quickly. So far, the indication is that's not happening. Other soldiers suggested that the reason looting is happening with such impunity that the IDF is engaged in wiping out many of those towns and villages, and the sense is what difference does it make if I take it, it's going to be destroyed anyway. Mass looting was similarly reported in Gaza, according to Haaretz, and in the course of that, only one indictment ever happened, which was ultimately settled with a plea deal. And we've seen videos of very modern, nice Lebanese homes being occupied by soldiers, gardens, lush gardens full of vegetables and fruit being completely raided. And then these Israeli soldiers just cooking themselves meals in these homes, desecrating them. They're lighting some of them on fire. We're seeing more and more of this happening in the West Bank as well. We're going to be discussing that. But of course, cities like Hiam, Beit Janel, and other places have been completely leveled. I mean, Israel is blowing up, massive, massive blocks of just territory, of neighborhoods and housing complexes and churches and mosques and other places, just completely leveling them. So like this person in the article said, well, we're just going to completely level it and blow it up anyway. So let's just take things out of the house. In Ben Jabel, which sections of it are being leveled. But again, even though Israel entered and tried taking the town within the first, week of their invasion into Lebanon, there was a video, and it was just released today, that showed 6 Hezbollah fighters besieged in a building for the past 2 weeks in the very center of Bint Jabal in southern Lebanon were killed by an airstrike after the IDF repeatedly failed to eliminate them in close quarters combat. So all these towns, there's dozens of Hezbollah fighters, resistance fighters holding up in the center of these places and holding out to the very, very end as Israel levels and demolishes all the areas around them. They're doing that well before they even take the centers of these towns. And, just compare that to how Russia is handling the situation in Ukraine. It shows you Jewish versus Christian warfare, I think, very obviously and very explicitly. But of course, the situation governmentally in Lebanon, I don't know if there's any risk of civil war. I think what really needs to happen is enough people in Lebanon need to make it clear that, yes, we want a unified Lebanon. Yes, we may even want Hezbollah and the main army properly integrated so there's not factionalism, but none of this can happen while we are dealing with this disgusting Israeli menace, which is very actively invading. So there's actually an IDF statement on the destruction of those soldiers I just read about in Beit Jabal. It says, earlier today, forces from the Paratroopers Brigade under the command of the 98th Division identified and eliminated 6 armed terrorists from the Hezbollah terror organization operating in Beit Jabal, south of the front defense line in southern Lebanon. The forces attacked the building from which the terrorists operated. In the strike, 4 additional terrorists who remained were eliminated. There were no casualties among our forces. This is another blatant violation of the ceasefire agreement by Hezbollah. Yes, somehow an airstrike on a Shia city, the center of which there were Hezbollah fighters getting blown up, is a violation of the ceasefire by Hezbollah. That's the Jewish media at work. But speaking of ceasefires that mean nothing, the headline here, Israeli strike hits vehicle in central Gaza, killing 3, including 2 civil defense workers. An Israeli strike on Gaza on Thursday hit a vehicle in the central part of the strip, killing at least 3 Palestinians, as the IDF continues its constant violations of the U.S.-backed ceasefire deal. According to the Quds News Network, 2 of the Palestinians are part of Gaza's civil defense, the enclave's agency that's responsible for emergency work and rescue operations. Photos from a funeral in Deir al-Balah show an orange vest worn by Palestinian civil defense workers on one of the bodies of the deceased. The Quds News Network also reported that about 5 people, including 3 children, who were killed the night before by an Israeli airstrike outside of a mosque in Beit Lahia, northern Gaza, have been identified as Abdullah al-Abed, age 9, Salah al-Abed, age 12, Mohammed Balusha, age 14, Allah Balusha, age 46, and Anas Abu Ful, age 19. Palestinians held a funeral for them at the Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City on Thursday. Gaza's health ministry said in its daily update, which it releases about midday Gaza time, that Israeli forces killed at least 6 Palestinians and wounded 18 over the previous 24 hours. A number of victims are still under the rubble and in the streets, as ambulance and civil defense crews have been unable to reach them so far, the ministry said. The ministry said that since the significant signing of the so-called ceasefire deal in early October, the IDF has killed 792 Palestinians in Gaza and wounded 2,235, meaning there are more than 3,000 Palestinian casualties. Amid the constant Israeli attacks, which have escalated this month, there's no signs of progress in the President Trump-backed Gaza plan, as the U.S. and Israel continue to demand Hamas's disarmament, while Hamas insists the issue cannot be discussed until the first phase of the ceasefire is actually implemented. And again, I said before, Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other resistance groups, Hamas within Gaza, again, if things go a certain way and things continue as they are in the West Bank and Lebanon and the shooting starts up again, that is another axis that could, reignite, which I know it was almost only Gaza for a little bit, but it's definitely not over there and could very much come back. But the situation, of course, in Lebanon and the West Bank are getting more and more similar. We've seen these videos of the settlers. Again, we've talked about the 38 new Israeli settlements approved by Smotrich and the Knesset and the Israeli Security Council, which is the largest expansion of civilian settlements since, I think, the establishment of the State of Israel, or rather some of the initial restrictions that were put on at some of these Oslo agreements, where usually it's only 3 or 4 settlements approved at once. And technically the United States is against all new settlements, but Israelis sealing houses, lighting Palestinian homes on fire. A family of 8 was injured when their house was lit on fire by settlers that surrounded them at night. More and more animals have been slaughtered. Houses and bakeries have been looted. The videos, it's new videos every day coming out of the West Bank. So we need to obviously be watching all of that very closely. And again, Israelis, they're cowards. I would be surprised if, they anticipate new Iranian bombings. Well, there will be less bombings of the West Bank because the Iranians don't want to bomb the Palestinians. So they go there and steal territory and everything. So in the future, perhaps if the Iranians could assist, and it's a lot harder to strike precision targets when the settlers are living on stolen land and tents and whatnot. But potentially we could see some things. Maybe the Yemeni Houthis could help with that, because it's a very sad thing to see what's going on in the West Bank. And it's worse than Gaza in some capacities as far as the pogroms and the on-the-ground terror is actually concerned. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of that, Dimitri. We did see Trump recently say that, and others, that the $1.5 trillion Pentagon war budget request will not include the Iran war. So the $200+ billion that we've already probably expended and will expend in the next month or so in this blockade and this war will not be included. So it's $1.5 trillion. Maybe it'll get all the way up to $2 trillion or so by the time it's all done, if we're including the Iran war tag that is latching on to all of this. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on the situation in Lebanon, Dimitri, the political situation with Nawaf Salam and Joseph Ayoun, the Lebanese forces, what the negotiations with Netanyahu mean, if the Lebanese people will really recognize that as legitimate, as well as everything going on in the West Bank and Gaza, before we talk about Russia, Ukraine, and a few other issues.
Clearly, I think the Lebanese general bureaucracy, considering that only a certain percentage of them are in fact Shia Muslims, are most likely just going to be pressured. We could probably extract some of that information even from the former defense minister who we interviewed recently, is that Lebanon as a country is not just indebted, but it also is a country which doesn't have that same sovereign fighting power. Without, of course, the presence of Hezbollah in the south, Lebanon itself would completely be ripe for the taking by the Israelis or any sort of enemy located towards the east. Potentially, I'm speaking about the Salafi Wahhabis who have made previous incursions into Lebanon. So it's completely not surprising that, look, if enough pressure is placed on the Lebanese state by the US, maybe some of its NATO allied countries such as France, the UK, and even, with some sort of international guarantees, Lord forbid, maybe the Security Council of the United Nations could also make some sort of arrangements. There could be, so to speak, buffer zones set up. The only issue is, with all of these discussions and arrangements, the talks never really take place between the official Hezbollah or in Palestine's case, in the Gaza Strip, with official Hamas spokespersons, or at least they try to avoid the actual people in the locations who hold power, who actually hold the guns and who actually care about the local populations there and try to protect them from Israeli aggression. So I think in terms of how long the peace will be standing between, or the ceasefire, how the continuation of this, and whether or not international involvement can stop Israeli aggression will, I think, greatly depend. At this point, the ball is entirely in Donald J. Trump's court. People have really beaten this horse dead for a while. Even somebody like Tucker Carlson has pointed out multiple times throughout various interviews that really it is the Trump administration willingness to go ahead with Bibi and Likud genocidal plans in Lebanon and in Palestine that have essentially given them that confidence and the arrogance to continue to perpetrate these endless wars in the Middle East. And yes, all of that, all of those budgets, the increase of the Ministry of Defense of America, the actual American military industrial complex and growing in size sounds really good on paper, except when you consider that the Americans haven't actually been carrying out defensive operations in defense of the mighty, rich, the very, I would just say, culturally dense and at this point even population dense United States. In fact, this money is being spent on international operations that can't even be justified in terms of thinking about it as a Cold War type scenario where there is a bilateral power division in the world and you have to fight back against the onslaught of civilizational communism and how countries are being transformed and made atheistic. You can't even use that excuse anymore, really. At this point, America's clearly in the hands of AIPAC, in the hands of the Israeli lobby, and all of that money being either printed, which causes inflation, or taken from the American citizens via taxpayer dollars and other extractions is going to be used. It's going to be used at the behest of Israel. That's probably the saddest part of this entire debacle in the Middle East, that it's being essentially paid for. It's being done at the expense of the average American. That's the sad part. In you can almost say there's a similar situation. Americans are almost in a similar boat to the Ukrainians, who are being used as cannon fodder and being used as essentially civilian material being thrown against the brotherly nation in Russia. Even you can almost say they are attacking their own family in the eastern portions of the former Ukrainian republics of Donetsk, Lugansk, and now parts of Zaporozhye and Kherson. So in some ways, Americans and Ukrainians really are in the same boat. So yes, maybe Americans aren't being lynched off the streets here and being kidnapped and being thrown into vans by the Tetsaka. I mean, there's some crazy kidnapping videos from Ukraine at the moment, Conrad, but it's very, very clear to me that both countries are well and truly subjugated and they're being used as battering rams in order to push certain learned elders' agenda forward very strictly as per the curriculum allows. And look, I mean, we can say this from 2025 onwards and all of Trump's tweets, they really showed this really almost bull-like determination where he's just driving the issue forward, not listening to advisors. There's been, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, there's been firings of some of the top general staff members from the US military. Clearly, there are people saying, no, we don't want to go along with this, even Joe Kent's resignation. But this doesn't seem to stop the military-industrial complex, which is entirely, I think, at this point, mind-controlled, pushing forward and, again, carrying out a foreign nation's plan into fruition. Yeah, no doubt if this war and conflict escalates and, the ceasefire for both Israel and America may in fact assist them in bringing in more Patriot and THAAD interceptors for some of their allied GCC Gulf state countries into Abu Dhabi, into the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and likewise, it's very interesting the position of Qatar as well, as you mentioned, but the entire Middle East at this point, Conrad, is in a very tense situation, and no doubt as like the week breaks, Monday, Tuesday comes around and the markets open up, we may see again further escalations. And look, it won't necessarily even be Iran's fault if Iran chooses to take some sort of unilateral power actions against the blockade that's being carried out against their country. There are like reports, and again, these are borderline fake news analyses, right, coming out from figures such as Patrick Bet-David, right, former sort of people whose families have fled Iran a long time ago, enemies of the current power structures in Iran, who openly have stated that, in fact, Iran, if it's not able to actually import any of the goods via this US blockade, is choking Iran off quite a bit, and maritime trade is subjected to this suffocation by the US, then perhaps Iran will eventually have some sort of domestic strife within the country. There will be protests, there'll be people not being able to receive their consumer goods. There'll be the Iranian plebeians will rise up against the regime. And, there have been US analysts throughout the week who have been saying that the only way to really constructively carry out a revolution within Iran is for the Iranian people to do it themselves with external assistance. And the most bizarre analogies that they make, Conrad, are actually quite devious. They don't make for example, the reference to 1776 Americans, where you basically had Americans with almost no foreign interference. I mean, obviously just rising up against their British imperial overlords, which was somewhat organic. You can say almost one of the only revolutions that didn't have a foreign country really funding and supporting them. But they make the reference to France, for example, which was the French Revolution was heavily Masonic at the end of the 1700s, clearly influenced by some very deeply occult groups from the inside of the country, destroying a once Roman Catholic, very traditional kingdom. But also some of these American analysts clearly, and I don't know if they're doing this accidentally or perhaps subconsciously, they're making reference to the Russian Revolution. They're saying, look, perhaps just like in Russia when the generals turned against the Tsar during the First World War and betrayed their own country and interests, and then, of course, the Bolsheviks came in and the revolution was carried out from essentially elements within the nation itself betraying Russia's national interests and, again, transforming the country from the inside with foreign assistance. And so I'm just thinking, does America really want to be, again, in the camp of the bad guys, like almost playing the role of the international Talmudic tribe, assisting the people of Iran to essentially subjugate their nation to international influence, as it once was at the end of the 19th and the early 20th centuries, when Iran really became a vassal state of the British Empire, especially after the Russian Revolution, when essentially the mullahs, even the Shah himself, had to bow down to British petroleum interests. And Iran really lost its sovereignty until the revolution of 1979. Not that I think the revolution was the best idea ever, but that's just the reality. Its sovereignty was only gained through that hyper-radical Shia move. So it is super interesting how almost subconsciously, Conrad, a lot of these geopolitical / historical analysts are making these analogies to some of the worst events in European and Christian world history and saying, well, we need to do something like this in Iran. Like, do you really want to be in the, compared to some of these evil groups of the past, like the Freemasons, the Talmudic Jews, and the traitor generals of the Russian World War I, a high command? Very, very strange. And of course, all of this is taking place in light of certain anniversaries, right? We have the Armenian anniversary of the genocide that took place. That began, of course, amidst World War I in 1915, the Armenian genocide, which took the lives of millions of Armenians, of course, during this genocide by the late Ottoman Empire, and of course, the various pashas. This particular genocide actually was carried out specifically against the Armenian population because the Ottoman imperial authorities at the time in 1915 and onwards, and especially the Young Turks themselves, they saw the Armenian minority within the country as somewhat subverting the local Turkish authority. And so they carried out this incredible genocide, which one day no doubt we'll have an Armenian expert or historian on to discuss with us in depth, because that's a very interesting chapter of, I think, just Near East, the South Caucasus Christian history, just to cover that. And in the context of the First World War, it's very important. And just in the Third World War, no doubt, I mean, we're already seeing genocides being carried out in a similar way against the Palestinians. But it's very interesting that the 111th anniversary of that Armenian genocide was met with high praise in the city of Yerevan. A lot of patriotic Armenians hit the streets. A lot of them made clear statements. They had reflections upon the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, that is the Armenian Republic of Artsakh, that one territory which was lost just several years ago to Azerbaijan after Azerbaijan defeated Armenia in a very localized war. And again, the Armenians were a little bit upset that the Russian Federation, perhaps through the CSTO, this security agreement that Armenia entered into after the fall of the USSR, didn't actually support the Armenian people in this conflict. But most likely that was done because the fact that Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikola Pashinyan, was in fact a Western stooge, and he continues to be so. And interesting, Nikola Pashinyan, the Prime Minister of Armenia, his statement on the anniversary of the Armenian genocide was very vague. He didn't mention the word Turkey or the Ottomans, not a single time, and he made half of his, I guess, reflections and his eulogy on the genocide about himself. He basically tried to justify the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, and he said, look, the Armenian people actually do not need this territory. Yes, we lost 15% of the country, but we don't actually need that 15 or so percent. And that Armenia can actually hold a population of at least 10 million people, but our population levels haven't reached that much. So he's basically saying the Armenian people need to try harder, and that, yes, we've lost the war, but we need to internally focus and be less susceptible to influences from external countries. Now, what is Prime Minister Pashinyan referring to here? Most likely he's talking about influence from Russia. Allegedly, Armenia, which has a Russian base on its territory in Gyumri, located not far from the capital city. And the Russians have never carried out any sort of operations within Armenia itself since the fall of the USSR. They've always had a very passive/friendly role in relation to Armenians. Pashinyan saying Armenia should be influenced less by Russia. Like, come on. Like, this guy's meeting with US, British, French officials. He's clearly already sold Armenia out to this quasi-NATO formation. If there's any country that's potentially going to join NATO but cannot do that because of territorial integrity issues, it is Armenia. It's really on that sort of in that Sweden, Finland camp. And just like the Baltic states, I think there is a portion of the Armenian elites who are very interested in this cultural westernization. They do not want to follow the Georgia model with the loss of Abkhazia and North Ossetia, which now Georgia is unable to join NATO because of that absence of territorial cohesiveness, shall we say, which is why I think Finland was in such a hurry to join NATO in 2024. But it is very interesting. And look, I just have to somewhat agree with Pashinyan here on one particular note. Historically, the heartlands of the Armenian people, where the majority of the populations lived, a lot of their churches, cathedrals, and monasteries were located, were in fact around Lake Van, which is now in Turkey, and Lake Sevan, which is now, of course, entirely Armenian. So historically, if we go back thousands of years, it's true the Armenian population, even in the BC period, wasn't necessarily hyper-fixated on that Nagorno-Karabakh territory, but we shouldn't really lose sight of the fact that, Azerbaijan itself, Pashinyan noticed he doesn't speak about Azerbaijan in a bad way. It's almost as if he's trying to, Conrad, reduce this conflict to a past memory in order to maybe focus on future, nation building, this particular Trump highway built, the link between the Turkish states that's being constructed. Pashinyan almost wants to move beyond localized conflicts and almost join this Turkic/NATO coalition with a vision for the future, which, again, I'm not going to make any moral judgments here, but it's very, very clear that Pashinyan, in preparation for the June 2026 parliamentary elections in Armenia, is trying to really change the way the Turkish question is being framed in the minds of Armenians. So it's super complicated. I'm sure we'll have more discussions about Armenia as the year progresses.
No, 100%. We didn't just see stuff happening in Armenia. We saw Jerusalemite Armenians in other places, even in America, coming out and, demonstrating, Putin and even other, Russian officials, made their comments and made their appearances. And there's always these eternal flames everywhere. Because remember, the Armenian genocide, it was also Pontic Greeks, and there was really a Christian genocide by the secularized, Jewish-dominated Turks, Young Turks, and Grey Wolves, and all of these groups. But you, of course, mentioned like the Trump corridor, and the Armenia being probably the most likely NATO candidate at this point. The fact that Pashinyan has been in power for so long is a very bizarre phenomenon. But again, the loss in Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia being probably one of the most post-Soviet countries at this point, especially the ones that aren't in Europe, that has been trying to move as far away as possible from Russia, despite that not really being what I think most people are looking towards. But before we move to some Russia stuff in particular, talking about the war there, I wanted to talk about Cyprus and Greece. The president of Cyprus, Nikos Christodoulidis, he made a big statement. He said, soon in June, the SOFA agreement will be signed, which will concern the hosting of French forces on Cypriot territory in the context of humanitarian operations in our region. So I'd wager this has a lot to do with the Lebanon situation. Multiple French UNIFIL soldiers, as well as a Indonesian UNIFIL soldier, were killed. The claim was that by Hezbollah, there were other UNIFIL soldiers that had been killed and wounded by confrontations with Israel. So it's clear the French are trying to, much like the British already have their bases, the French are going to have a presence on Cyprus, probably to deal with their lingering colonial military peacekeeping responsibilities through the UN and just in general in Lebanon that they possess, as Lebanon being a former holding for them. And I don't think I addressed this last week, and I meant to address it on my World War live stream, which again, every Tuesday evening, 7:45 p.m., Substack, YouTube, X, I'm live on my World War live show. But of course, the Greek government issued a response to Turkish provocations in their exclusive economic zone in their waters. Again, St. Paisios prophesied that once the 12-mile economic zone, which is the 12 miles off the coast of Greece's islands, which is right up to the coast of Turkey, basically giving Turkey no real exclusive economic zone at all in the Aegean. Turks want to move that back to 6 miles, so that the Greeks only have 6 miles of economic zone off the island's coast. And in response to this, Greece submitted a letter to the UN on March 31st, 2026, fully rejecting Turkey's maritime claims as unfounded and illegal. Athens reaffirmed that Greek islands possess full maritime rights under the law of the sea, including territorial waters up to 12 nautical miles, an exclusive economic zone, and a continental shelf. It dismisses Turkey's casus belli, rejects the Turkish-Libyan memorandum and the agreement with the Northern Cyprus administration as invalid, and refutes Ankar's objections to the Greek-Egyptian delimitation. Greek also condemns Turkish maps that disregard Greek sovereignty over islands and islets. While reserving all its rights, Athens reiterates its commitment to resolving maritime disputes peacefully and in accordance with international law. So again, I think after Erdogan falls, or maybe right before Erdogan falls, in the midst of growing Israeli, Cypriot, Greek cooperation, again, the French are getting involved here. The British, potentially they'll get dragged in and have to do more things off of their Akrotiri and Dikelia bases. Remember when we reported on the Cypriot intelligence chief making that secret call to Hezbollah, informing him in very no uncertain terms that we are making sure that our bases are not used to strike you and everything, so that Hezbollah doesn't hit them with drones. So, Cyprus, they have a very vested interest in trying to stay neutral here. The prophecies talk about them staying neutral after a brief slap from the Turks. The Turks will have to withdraw their troops from northern Cyprus, the occupying territory, and then it says they'll occupy 3 islands. I know Rhodes, I believe Lesbos, maybe one other. I think Crete will also be briefly occupied. And all of this will begin very shortly after the 12 nautical miles are reduced down to 6, which, again, that might happen before Erdogan falls, but they're trying to appease the Turks, or maybe after Erdogan falls and this new government gets in power, they will demand this. And to secure Turkey's cooperation against Russia, perhaps the United States will allow this, and that will be our sign to know that the things regarding Greece, Cyprus, Russia, Turkey are very much on the horizon. So we're watching Erdogan. We're watching the EEZ, as it seems, on the precipice of hitting that mark and being moved, as St. Paisios prophesied. So we're going to be watching all of that very closely. Obviously, the situation in the Bosphorus, Dardanelles, and Aegean, with Cyprus off the coast of Lebanon, it's clear that the Israelis are trying to annex those regions of southern Lebanon to get access to the major gas and oil fields that Lebanon has access to off the coast there, much like the situation in Gaza. So deep energy wars as well as the metaphysical war are coalescing at the same time, and that's what we bring you here on World War Now, that merging of theopolitics, and the analysis of the saints and the prophecies, as well as the deep energy, political realism, espionage analysis, from people like George McMillan, the other experts that we have on the show. And that's why Yaqub Saraf is such an incredible guest, because he, is a true political actor in the region, a defense minister of Lebanon, as well as a devout Orthodox Christian with an Athenite spiritual father. He understands where we're coming from and is a true World War Now guest, as well as a true Roman Christian patriot. But of course, the other major war going on is in Russia and Ukraine, and there have been some pretty interesting developments there this week as the Russians continue to move forward and have made it more and more clear. I know there have been some statements and some movements that have made it clear that not only will Russia be clearing out the rest of Donetsk and taking it very soon, likely by the end of the summer, they will be trying to do the same with Zaporozhye and Kherson, as well as likely moving all the way to Odessa, advancing their position in Dnipropetrovsk, and moving deeper into Sumy and Kharkov regions, potentially, taking the city of Sumy itself and beginning the siege of Kharkov very, very soon. So I'd love your analysis on the frontline situation in Ukraine.
No, of course, the siege of Kharkov, I think, will soon commence, especially if we consider that Volchansk has already fallen, a city which the Russians and Ukrainians have been fighting over on the borders of Kharkovskaya Oblast and Belgorodskaya Oblast for at least 2 years now. Volchansk has fallen. Kupiansk, the Russians are still fighting back Ukrainian counterattacks, but Kupiansk is more or less under the, I would say, operational control of the Russian armed forces. And the Russians do hold this exceptional bridgehead located in Zaporozhye, roughly around 15 to 20 kilometers away from the outskirts of Zaporozhye city itself. So they're in fact very close to their goals at actually commencing. Think of it this way, like as soon as the Russians reach the outskirts of Zaporozhye, begin taking certain suburbs, begin taking blocks, apartment buildings, and then they begin entrenching themselves. We saw this sort of siege-like process during the Second World War in the Battle of Stalingrad. The same urban warfare will commence, and we know the Russians are well and truly their high-level expertise at doing so. And you have to think about the Dnieper Group. So the Russian military Dnieper Group is essentially a construction of regular Russian elite army forces as well as VDV, Russian airborne commandos, which would be equivalent to maybe what Commonwealth countries like the UK, Australia, and New Zealand have, the SAS airborne commando forces, well, similar to the airborne forces of the United States, would drop off by parachute. But, for the last 3 years, there's been no airborne operations due to the intensifying drone warfare. There's been literally no one dropping off of a parachute for the last at least 1,000 days in the Russo-Ukrainian war. The last time we saw any sort of even helicopter drop-off operation was that weird, almost cinema-esque attack the Ukrainians conducted. And it was maybe an extraction operation. It wasn't very clear in Mirnograd that took place last year when they landed 3 or 4 helicopters and then they conducted some sort of airborne extraction operation at nighttime. But since then, of course, most of the VDV airborne commandos from both the Ukrainians and the Russians have in fact been fighting on the land, which in order to become a VDV airborne commando, you do need to, the training for that is much more intensive than those of regular armed forces. And probably the Russians putting these elite infantry troops of a mixed composition in the Dnieper battle group into Primorsk, which is located, of course, on the coast of the Dnieper River, approaching Zaporozhye and in Sniptogorsk. The Russians are holding these two little towns, preparing almost for an eventual, as you said, Conrad, a June, July, August summer offensive pushing deeper into Zaporozhye city. As soon as the opening is provided for the Russians, no doubt they could reach Zaporozhye suburbs within at least a week, I think, progressively, especially if they have enough air superiority in that particular region and they begin to overwhelm the Ukrainians. The Russians have been building up their tank forces for quite some time. We've seen very limited tank strikes in terms of big tank groups moving as one, at least since the Ukrainian counteroffensive of the summer of 2023. And we know the Russians have been well and truly stockpiling all of that military hardware for quite some time. So whether or not the Russians are just trying to conserve power in order to expose the Ukraine's weakness on any one of these particular theaters is well and truly was probably going to happen. And again, we're all awaiting the inevitable siege of Druzhkovka, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk, which is well and truly going to commence soon as Konstantinovka is continuing to be suppressively bombed by the Russians. We've seen the use of everything from THAADs to potentially phosphorus to all kinds of, the city is being rained on by Russian munitions from afar. The domination of the Russians, the only thing that's really holding the Russians back is, of course, the absence, I think, of those Starlink terminals, which again, essentially throwing communications off slightly, but the Russians already have adjusted and are moving back to more regular radio usage. And again, the Ukrainian drone swarms, which are continuing to flow in to Konstantinovka and the outskirts, the defensive positions held by the Russians. So it's extremely tedious for the Russians to take even the smallest of villages and towns without, of course, potentially suffering losses from these Ukrainian drones. Just to think about it logistically for certain listeners who may not imagine, there's at least 2 drones per infantryman available in the front lines. And roughly the Ukrainians, this is how widespread the Ukrainian and Russian troops are. In order to hold 1 kilometer or at least, 1 mile of territory on any of the front lines, it takes about 5 to 6 personnel, from the Ukrainian armed force. So everyone's stretched very thin. There aren't these huge clumps of troops being located anywhere except for some of these urban locations where they do have the protection of these former civilian buildings, which are now essentially turned into these mini fortresses in cities like Kupiansk and Konstantinovka. But being out in the fields is a very hazardous event, I think, for both forces. So the conservatism of the Russians and Ukrainians is sort of only the conservativeness of the Russians and Ukrainians to carry out massive counteroffensives is expressed only by sort of the absence of cities to siege. All the cities that the Russians are sieging at the moment are within range. And yes, as soon as the go-ahead is given, most likely it will come with a heavy bombardment of the back lines of being held in Ukraine. Just to, again, express to the listeners some of the interesting details that have come out from the Ukrainian mayoral authority itself. They've stated, so as you know, the Dnieper River upstream, it actually, when it goes through the city of Kiev, it splits the city into 2. And on the left bank of the Dnieper, that is on the eastern side of the Dnieper, in the city of Kiev, there are at least several hundred apartment buildings which are currently still without power. And allegedly, because the thermoelectric power stations are just simply non-operational, the Russians have been hitting them so efficiently with their drone strikes and Iskander strikes that the eastern side of Kiev will not have any power until next winter. So we're talking December 2026, January 2027. They're still repairing those electrical power stations. The Russians, by the way, have expressed that they're only striking these stations primarily because the Ukrainians have created these mini drone and arms factories nearby and actually are siphoning energy from these civilian infrastructure energy hubs and essentially using them in order to power military operations. So the Russians are using, of course, the excuse that they're not actually trying to demoralize the civilian population. They're trying to stunt the growth of drone production by the Ukrainian armed forces, which is fair enough, fairly understandable reasons, at least being expressed by the Russian high command. That's very interesting. There's obviously been a huge corruption scandal within Ukraine. It's quite insane. So Zelensky actually appointed a man named Denis Lutny as the head of the security service in Kharkov. So as you said, Conrad, perhaps in preparation for the defense of Kharkov, maybe to rout out any sort of leftover Russian dissidents from those Kharkov protests of 2014. So now this Denis Lutny character is not just corrupt, but there's been internal Ukrainian releases, like press releases about him. Apparently he has relatives within Kharkov who are provincial school teachers. There's like old people in his family who receive the Ukrainian like aged pension. There's these small business owners who suddenly begin, at least over the last few years since the SMO have begun purchasing huge new homes, holiday houses around Ukraine, apartment buildings, expensive cars, motorcycles, some of them worth over $1 million American dollars in value. So the relatives of all these high people in Ukrainian command, not just Zelensky, but even like regional people like Denis Lutny in Kharkov, have suddenly begun to come about this huge wealth. And I doubt it's from his regular serviceman salary available in Ukraine, even though that is, of course, also bolstered by American and European taxpayer dollars. So there is this sort of corruption literally stringing itself throughout the entire Russo-Ukrainian war, especially on the Ukrainian side. The other interesting thing is, of course, the Prince of the United Kingdom, Prince Harry, one of the heirs to the throne, the second son of King Charles III, arrived in Kiev on the 24th of April. So again, we get a clown show. And I'm not sure if Meghan Markle arrived in Kiev either, but specifically, he was arrived and greeted by the former Jewish actual Prime Minister of Ukraine, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, which is very symbolic. Again, a member of the Talmudic tribe needs to greet you in the ancient Russian Orthodox city of Kiev. And he greeted Prince Harry, and of course, Prince Harry attended the Kiev Security Forum there. And specifically, apparently, the remarks were that Ukraine produces some of the most advanced drones, and perhaps these drones could be even sold to the UK in the future. So Prince Harry is almost like the spokesperson now for the British regime. It's interesting that when Trump was asked this question, Trump said that he does not believe Prince Harry speaks on behalf of the United Kingdom. And then Trump remarked in a very comedic fashion, he says, I think I speak more on behalf of Britain than Prince Harry does. It's like, okay. So you can kind of see Ukraine trying to continue to bolster its international reputation by inviting these celebrities around from everything from Orlando Bloom, Angelina Jolie, whose security guard was taken and almost recruited into Ukrainian armed forces, to Prince Harry. I mean, the clown show, the circus continues whilst innocent people are sent into these meat grinders by the Ukrainian terrorist regime, and the church continues to be persecuted. So that's all quite insane. But just in the context of the Russo-Ukrainian war, despite Russia's inevitable advances, there are reports, and this is from primarily Ukrainian-led media, so we have to take this with a huge grain of salt. I'm not trying to misrepresent the Russian position at all, but apparently there was a Ukrainian drone strike combined with a missile strike on an apartment building somewhere in Donetsk, which housed at least 12 FSB officers. So Ukrainians are claiming they hit this like jackpot. Notice that this was in Donetsk city itself, so Ukrainians continue to bomb the capital of the Donetsk People's Republic to this day, which is, again, areas that Conrad visited last year, and he was like literally walking along these streets. The Ukrainians are still targeting civilian apartments, claiming they're killing FSB officers. So exactly the same sort of conduct you see Israel carry out south of the Litani River. It's like first you strike and then you claim, yep, we have Hezbollah, we have FSB operatives killed, etc. So same sort of Talmudic signature we see behind both of these actions. But unfortunately, speaking about the FSB, there has been something incredibly cringe being done. Of course, there is an FSB academy located, the famous FSB academy going back to the early 1920s, the early Bolshevik Revolution, Russian Civil War time, established by Vladimir Lenin and a lot of the chief Bolsheviks at the time. This academy was built to train Soviet security personnel, which later became known as the Cheka, the Cheka, which we all know from literally reading the lives of saints, because these are the people who tortured, killed Orthodox Christian priests, Russian monarchists, army officers, and any Orthodox Christians who resisted the early Bolshevik rule. This academy that taught Cheka spies, Cheka internal domestic terrorist officers, and those Jewish commissars that you see and hear about in various types of historic literature in relation to Eastern Europe. This commissar factory was then transformed to accommodate for OGPU, NKVD, KGB officers to train these people in Moscow. It's located in the southwestern suburbs of Moscow, just outside of the city center. It was renamed this week. Of course, now it's the FSB Training Academy, but it was renamed this week by President Putin via an executive order. So it was specifically, personally, Putin himself. His signature is on the paper. It was published. We spoke about it on our Telegram channel. We've publicized it. He named the FSB Academy after Felix Dzerzhinsky, that is Iron Felix, the architect of the Red Terror, one of Lenin's top guys, a man who was incredibly talented at murdering people, torturing people. Again, a very charismatic figure, definitely as talented as Netanyahu in terms of, moving himself through the leadership of certain Bolshevik groups. And he held incredibly high positions to a point where even Stalin himself was jealous of Dzerzhinsky. Apparently, Dzerzhinsky claims he was a minor Polish nobleman in the past. A lot of Polish patriots and nationalists online actually claim that Dzerzhinsky comes from a more devious Talmudic roots, who have just simply either purchased or in fact have masqueraded themselves as Polish, as minor Polish noblemen, because Polish nobility was just a huge caste of a huge social strata within Poland itself. So it was quite easy to simply pretend you're a Polish nobleman of some minor house, for example, a Game of Thrones-esque type scenario. But Dzerzhinsky, of course, could speak multiple languages fluently, including Yiddish, very interestingly. And he did marry a Bolshevik terrorist named Sofia as well. She was an early revolutionary who was of Ashkenazi origin. So this particular figure, Putin just named the largest and oldest Russian Special Operations FSB Academy after this figure, Felix Dzerzhinsky, which is a huge shame because Dzerzhinsky himself didn't just kill enemies of the Russian state, enemies of the USSR, but he personally has executed Orthodox Christians. And there are even theories, and maybe we'll go into that in the future releases of Ritual Regicide. Dzerzhinsky may have even personally participated in the transportation of the head of Tsar Nicholas II from Yekaterinburg. So very devious figure. I'm not sure why President Putin is doing this. I mean, this is another major era of decision-making, and clearly the Lord will not be fond of this sort of behavior within Russia. Again, how does this help the Russian cause of fighting against so-called globalist Satanism and the terrorist state of Ukraine? I'm not entirely sure, but we still need to report on this. I mean, President Putin naming FSB academies after Bolshevik terrorists is probably not a good sign. And you just have to listen to some of our previous 8 hours to find out what the implications of that may be. But yes, that's the Russo-Ukrainian news, Conrad. And one last piece. There is, of course, a huge ecological crisis happening in the Black Sea on the east coast near the port of Novorossiysk. As I mentioned, 120 kilometers to the southeast of that, the port of Tuapse. It's a small town. Tuapse was primarily used as an oil refinery plant, which the Ukrainians bombed a few days ago. And there's been 4 to 5 days of continuous fires. And a lot of that refined oil and even crude oil actually spilled into the river that later outpoured into the Black Sea. So yes, there is an ecological crisis. There's birds, animals, and fish all dying due to the ecological contamination. Again, unfortunate that Ukrainians are hitting this civilian infrastructure and causing all of these deaths of animals and people. But there's no reports in terms of personnel casualties, but the oil refinery was burning for a good 3 to 4 days. And again, it's against the law in Russia to film it. So there is footage and photographs of the massive fires at Tuapse on the east coast of the Black Sea in Russia. But, whoever filmed those particular clips probably put themselves in jeopardy from the Russian FSB. Let's just say that, because there are clear indicators, just like in Israel and in Iran, you're not really supposed to film targets for the enemy to show the results of their terror strikes, which is very interesting. But that's the Russo-Ukrainian news, Conrad, really sort of showing us that the conflict is kind of building up towards potentially, now that the earth is hardening up towards a potential counteroffensive by the Russians, pushing back the Ukrainians further westwards. And yes, after the fall of Kramatorsk, Druzhkovka, and Slavyansk, it's basically free sailing until the cities of Dnipro and the cities of Zaporozhye. There are almost no defensive formations that Ukraine can use to bolster itself against. So the Russians are standing almost on a precipice, which is maybe why Putin is coming out and saying, look, I don't mind having peace talks with Ukraine, because Russia is in a very commanding position at this point.
Now, you talked about the Dzerzhinsky statue and the renaming of the all of this nonsense from Putin executive order. And I think, when the next Tsar comes, when the military leader emerges, we'll be tearing down the statue and, renaming the FSB, the Okhrana, and we'll be going full empire once again. But before we move on from Russia, Ukraine, we have this statement from the Romanian Ministry of Defense. It says, on the morning of Saturday, April 25th, Russian forces resumed drone attacks on civilian and infrastructure targets in Ukraine near the river border with Romania in Tulcea County. The British Eurofighter Typhoon aircraft made radar contact with a target located 1.5 kilometers from Reni. Over Ukrainian territory, the pilots were authorized to engage the drones. The Ministry of National Defense's ground-based radar made contact with a group of targets as far as the area of Reni, Ukraine, where multiple explosions were reported. Initial assessments indicate that an outbuilding on a property and an electricity pole were affected with no significant damage. Fragments of a drone have been identified in several locations in the area, which has been secured. So, another close incursion with the Romanians there. Again, a hot button issue with the NATO thing. Obviously, not only have Romanian bases been used to defend and launch air defense and jets for defense of Ukraine, but have also been a major refueling and launch site for bombings that have taken place in the Iran war. So Romania, total NATO Zog slave. It's very unfortunate to see. But the rest of NATO, and this is from Reuters, Trump has been talking about punishing NATO a lot, potentially pulling out of NATO. He's really been going after Spain and the NATO countries. For example, Spain restricted all bases from use by the United States in this Iran operation. It says here, Reuters reports that the Pentagon is drafting plans for punishing NATO allies who fail to support the U.S. in its war against Iran. These options include suspending Spain from the NATO alliance, reassessing U.S. diplomatic support for European imperial possessions to include Britain's claim to the Falkland Islands near Argentina, suspending difficult countries from important or prestigious positions in NATO. There are no options to close U.S. bases in the email and no option for withdrawing U.S. from the alliance in the email. So that seems to be what they are initially discussing. But the situation, obviously, between Russia and Ukraine, I expect it to slowly but surely, the offensive will be ramping up. Again, the spring rains have been dying down and the ground is slowly but surely hardening as the days get longer and the sun is up for a more extended period of time. So again, expect to see the advances throughout the summer slowly but surely expanding. I don't know how much Ukraine is going to be able to resist as much as they would like, but I would expect to see by the end of the summer, Donetsk region fully liberated. The Svyatogorsk Monastery, of course, is right on the border right now. And it appears that the pushes into Dnipropetrovsk and these other regions are only going to increase. This also came out and has been a common discussion as more and more assets have been moved to the Middle East. It says here the U.S., this is from the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. has burned through so many munitions in Iran that some administration officials increasingly assess that America couldn't fully execute contingency plans to defend Taiwan from a Chinese invasion if it occurred in the near term, U.S. officials said. In addition, over 1,000 Tomahawk missiles, as well as 1,500 to 2,000 air defense missiles such as THAAD, Patriot, and Standard missile interceptors have been used during the war in Iran. According to U.S. officials, it would take about 6 years to fully replenish the stockpile. When questioned about the story, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said it was fake news. So before we move on to church news or any other fronts like Cuba, when the U.S. spy drones and planes have been circling Cuba incessantly, of course, the energy from Russia and Mexico continues to flow into Cuba, but Trump continues to say that Cuba is next on the list. But with all of that, I'd love any final thoughts you have on Russia, their summer offensive, how it is going to go, China, Taiwan, as well as NATO before we move on to church news.
Yeah, I think, look, a lot of red lines have been crossed, even over the past 6 months. Inevitably, President Putin, he's already being pressured, and he was pressured even by a lot of the very patriotic Z bloggers online to take much stronger actions, to be more like Djugashvili, Stalin, for example, which I think is a bit of a silly analogy given Stalin's failure throughout pretty much at least half of the Second World War in terms of actually giving a proper response to the Third Reich. But they're saying that Putin needs to be strong like Stalin and give a proper retaliation to the NATO incursion, the globalist Satanists, which Lavrov, again, in an interview, like he does keep giving this open statement. I think a lot of people find it interesting, but he keeps calling the West a globalist satanic regime, like he keeps referring to it in those particular words. But mind you, I doubt very much Lavrov is referring to Chabad Lubavitch, the learned elders of Zion, or any of these Talmudic power structures, which we know hold almost supreme, unquestionable authorities over a lot of these locations around the world. Various countries are directly subjugated to their local Chabad centers. These people have a supreme authority. We see that they are literally delegations, not just the members of Chabad meeting Prince Harry in Kiev. Members of Chabad are conducting the peace talks. It's very clear who really has sort of authority, and vaguely calling the enemy satanic is also problematic in that how do you then carry out ceasefire and peace talks with Satanists Like, again, if you're going to dehumanize your enemy to a certain extent, then how will you ever be able to sit at the same table, shake hands with them, kiss them in the brotherly way, or even, for example, sign documents together, anticipating that Satanists will be somehow in good faith upholding any sort of diplomatic agreements that you signed? I mean, it makes it very silly. And this is one of the great warnings of the war. It's like, well, you put out this really hyperbolic rhetoric the entire time, which doesn't even hit home, like vaguely calling the Ukrainian Satanists without actually identifying who exactly the groups are. They, actually perpetrating the conflict from the very beginning will not actually assist you, and it'll make you look very silly, similar to how you looked, and I'm addressing, of course, President Putin and some of his top executive officers when they were shaking hands with a former member of Al-Qaeda, al-Shara al-Jilani, when he, of course, arrived in Moscow. Like, you call these people jihadis, head choppers, and then, they will be sitting in your chairs, they'll be eating from your tables, and you will look like the maxing clowns that you try to avoid becoming throughout, your diplomatic actions. And history books will not look at you very fondly. So that's the thing. There's a double-edged sword here when we use this sort of very strong anti-Ukrainian, shall we say, anti-Western propaganda. Be very careful with the way you word it, because if you'll be the one going to the G20 summit, and look, this is why Trump is careful with the way he, notice, and I don't mean to say Trump is like an expert at diplomacy, but notice how he constantly says, well, the Chinese are very smart, they're our colleagues, they're giving gifts to Iran, but then he pops out a disclaimer and says that, look, they may be sending something to Iran via the Tuska ship, but in fact, I'm still going to Beijing in the middle of May. So Trump knows how to play this game. It doesn't seem like a lot of the political masterminds within the Kremlin are actually at that particular diplomatic level to try and balance their interests. That, look, Russia, for better or for worse, will continue to, at least with this particular regime in power, United Russia Party, given they have family members, real estate overseas in a lot of Western countries, they're clearly very Western of mind. They'll continue to play a role in this globalist capitalist world, and simply throwing out statements such as accusations and allegations of Satanism at your enemies, whilst then you'll be sitting and eating with them, dining with them, is a little bit silly. You will look inconsistent, and it will, in fact, if anything, I think it's almost abusing Christian wording in order to push some sort of very strange and most likely anti-Orthodox agenda further down the road. Who knows exactly, but that's just my sort of small reflections on some of the diplomatic language used by Lavrov. Now, just in terms of like the church news, there's been a lot of very minor stories, some of them actually quite positive. One of those was Metropolitan Onufry himself has visited the southwest Ukrainian region of Bukovina, which is a region that actually cuts through into Moldova and Ukraine. And he was greeted by so many people in the streets. This is a western, you can say southwestern region of Ukraine that you'd think was completely controlled by unions and the OCU. But Metropolitan Onufry was completely surrounded by people coming up to him, asking for blessings, things like that in the weeks after Easter, and people were so happy to see him. It shows you the power of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, despite persecution, despite all the bad libel and the defamation that was thrown against the church, calling it an agent of Russia, literally in an area where you'd think there'd be some sort of pro-Romanian, Moldovan separatist leanings and tendencies towards maybe Ukraine becoming European or NATO-wized. No, the regular Orthodox Christians in these regions still love Metropolitan Onufry. They love the Orthodox Church. They're not actually listening to what Zelensky is saying over the television through state-sponsored media. There's been obviously some very unfortunate news. Father Oleg Pogonishev has been confirmed to be kidnapped by the Ukrainian armed forces out of the Odessa Oblast sometime during the Easter period. So he's missing at the moment. He most likely was recruited into the Ukrainian armed forces. So we need to keep Father Oleg in our prayers. And this was reported by the Odessa Archdiocese. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church official media side hasn't actually mentioned Father Oleg being taken, because, again, they're walking this real tightrope with the Ukrainian official government. So they're trying not to anger them too much. There was, of course, a lot of Orthodox Christians, rightly so, especially priests online from America, have pointed out the weird support of the evangelicals around the world for example, the Zelensky regime in Israel, whilst Israel has officially announced there's going to be a massive gay pride parade festival located on the Dead Sea in the exact areas where Sodom and Gomorrah historically were located in the Old Testament. So that's quite insane. And a lot of people, even Russian priests, have been pointing this out, that look, Israel is actually these are Russian priests who claim not to be anti-Semitic in any official way. They're like, look, well, Israel is the world's most homosexual country, just like officially, statistically on paper. Tel Aviv is the capital of homosexuality. And they're just openly now, it's becoming abundantly clear that even the Netanyahu hardcore militarized sort of Spartan regime is still heavily influenced by the LGBTQ culture, which again, their country allows to perpetrate itself. The other interesting news is there was an archpriest, Vyacheslav Litvinenko. Unfortunately, he perished in a car accident. So again, most likely car accidents, we understand this could have been an entirely accidental collision. It could have been, for example, maybe somebody tried to take him out. I'm not sure, but Archpriest Vyacheslav is having a funeral. This particular Archpriest, unfortunately, does not have the best reputation in Ukraine because he was actually one of the early members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church canonically who joined the anti-terrorist, anti-Donetsk, anti-Lugansk operation. And he was an unofficial military chaplain of sorts. He joined the Poroshenko regime, the Maidan regime, as a military chaplain for Ukraine, and he fought against the various military groups in Donetsk and Lugansk. Very early on, he personally participated in the battles for Slavyansk, Debaltseve, Kramatorsk. Very early on, this Father Vyacheslav is now going through the toll houses. Maybe we should also commemorate him in prayer as well, given his very tumultuous 12-year history, being a priest on the front lines and maybe making the wrong choices, but still at some point canonically ordained. And there was a very powerful statement made by Patriarch Kirill in the week following Easter. I think it was on the 20th or 22nd of April, just this week. Patriarch Kirill, again, openly criticized very lightly. Notice Patriarch Kirill, he does have this very diplomatic way of speaking to the ecumenical patriarchate, but he said the ecumenical patriarchs view that that he has this quasi-papal authority over all dioceses around the world, and that all dioceses and all jurisdictions need to somehow ratify their major decisions with the EP. He says that's completely incorrect. It's the wrong view of ecclesiology. So Patriarch Kirill, in a way, of Moscow, is standing up against papalism in the Orthodox Church, well, in the face of ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew. So that's, I think, necessarily a good thing, and maybe even will move away. There are accusations that Patriarch Kirill himself is a papalist, but I think that's completely wrong. And clearly Patriarch Kirill, his primary focus is domestically on actually catechizing the Russian people and increasing the number of diocese priests. Russia itself literally needs to be re-evangelized, as is happening now, even after the SMO process has commenced. There's obviously great content has been around this week, Conrad, not just from World War Now, but there's been an amazing interview of Tucker Carlson, interviewed Father Josiah Trenum. So that was absolutely incredible. I recommend listeners go watch that. There was a great interview by our friend Buck Johnson, interviewing, again, another fellow Orthodox Christian, Darrell Cooper. So there's been an abundance of content from fellow Orthodox Christian creators and figures in the media that is absolutely worth watching. Even if you are very learned, like a lot of our listeners are here, maybe this information is in some way repeating itself, but hearing it again from some of these authoritative voices in the Orthodox Church community from various jurisdictions, I think is an incredibly healthy thing. Just to understand, it's an insane world out there, and we are in the Third World War, but we are, in fact, I think, mostly saying the correct things, despite the fact that mainstream media is counter-signaling most of what you're hearing, specifically on this show, but also coming out from the mouths of many other Orthodox Christian persons.
No, very true. An abundance of content from an abundance of goyim. But, every year we're going to be bringing in at least 25,000 new Orthodox Christians, it seems, at the minimum, if not more, if the things in the Holy Spirit keeps moving the way that it's moving. So maybe the content creators are slightly ahead of the curve, but as the population fills in and more people embrace Holy Orthodoxy, there will be a well-refined suite of content and analysis, from us, of course, and from other content creators. So look forward to some big shows coming up. We've got some guests coming, and I know some other people are working on some big things as well. But as far as my contribution here to the church news section, it has been 13 years since the abduction of the Antiochian Orthodox Bishop of Aleppo, Metropolitan Paul Yazigi. He was abducted as the same, was it Aleppo or was it? Yeah, it definitely was Aleppo. Sorry, I'm reading the statement here from Patriarch John and from the Patriarch of the Syriac Church, who their Metropolitan, John Ibrahim, was also abducted. But they released a statement. It said, on this day in 2013, our brethren, both Metropolitans of Aleppo, John Ibrahim and Paul Yazigi, were abducted. To this day, their cases partly reflected the hideous humanitarian tragedy in the Levant. Their case remains an affront of deceit, upon the brow of truth, the truth slaughtered on the threshold of senseless wars and collapsing interests. And at this point, there have emerged certain inquiries that seem to indicate that, I believe within the first 2 or 3 years after the abduction, they were killed. And I remember when I first became Orthodox, I attended an Antiochian parish that was mostly Syrian. We prayed for the safe return of Metropolitan Paul every Sunday. I think at this point, it's widely understood that he was killed by militants, but there's been no official investigation. There have been no conclusions. No one's found his body. No one has, really testified to the exact events that occurred. So these two church figures, well, only one being an Orthodox church figure, but pray for them. You can look into the story. It's a very tragic thing, and unfortunately, the people that perpetrated this kidnapping and whatnot are now largely the people that are in power in Syria. So we have to pray for the Antiochian Archdiocese, the Patriarchate, and for the Christians there, because they are very much in the hands of head choppers and evil people, as you mentioned. But getting a little bit more positive, it has now been 40 days since the Patriarch Ilya reposed in the Lord, the Georgian Patriarch who ruled on the patriarchal throne for 48 years. It says here the Georgian Orthodox Church will observe the 40th day since the repose of His Holiness Catholicos Patriarch Ilya on Saturday, April 25th, with church officials revealing a final wish to the late spiritual leader had expressed for his flock. The Patriarch had asked that each Georgian, for the glory of God, would correct at least one personal flaw and abandon it forever. If each of us does this also in the name of our Patriarch, imagine how much of the Lord's grace and mercy will be bestowed upon our nation, how we will gladden His holiness and beatitude with this, and what great help will this be for both our and His soul, the Church's public relations service said in a statement released Wednesday. Patriarch Ilya reposed on March 17th. According to Christian teaching, the 40th day holds particular significance based on deeds accomplished in this world. On the 40th day, the soul is settled in a place that will not change until the second coming, the statement explains. The Church notes that all of Georgia has been praying for the late Patriarch, with many seeking ways to honor his memory beyond prayer alone. It's very important, for example, to do good deeds for your neighbor, the statement says, emphasizing various ways the faithful can support the departed Patriarch's soul. So, very good to see from the Georgians. Again, if I were to guess, and it seems likely the Metropolitan Shio, the current locum tenens of the Church, likely the effective appointed successor of Patriarch Ilya, he will be both presiding over the election of the new Patriarch, which should be starting in the next few days and weeks. And he will likely be the front-runner candidate, and I think will win, and I hope he does, because he is a strong protector of the canonical church order and would not concelebrate with the Ukrainian schismatics and supports Metropolitan Onufry. So that is what we want to see. And speaking of brave bishops who refuse to participate in ecumenism and other heretical nonsense, Bishop Isaac of Velbuzd, the vicar of the Sofia metropolis of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, he visited Istanbul from April 9th to 13th, and reportedly he refused to concelebrate, or rather participate in certain events and services that included heterodox Christians who would be reading scripture and other such things. It says here this is from Ortho Christian. Bishop Isaac arrived in Turkey with a church delegation at the invitation of the local Bulgarian community to lead services during Holy Week. However, on Pascha, the Bulgarian hierarch chose not to participate in the service at the Patriarchal Cathedral of St. George in the Fanar, according to a report from Pravblog. According to the tradition established there, representatives of the Roman Catholic, Armenian, and Syriac Jacobite churches are invited to read the gospel in different languages on this day. Upon seeing representatives of other Christian denominations in the church, Bishop Isaac left the cathedral. Instead, he read the Paschal message of the Holy Synod of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church before his flock in Istanbul's Sishli district on the territory of the Bulgarian Exarchate's Metochion. Bishop Isaac's actions represent a notable contrast to May 2024, when 5 Bulgarian bishops concelebrated with Ukrainian schismatics at the Patriarchal Cathedral of St. George. Another incident occurred during the Holy Thursday service when a Bulgarian deacon, accompanying the bishop, commemorated not only Patriarch Bartholomew during the litanies, but also Bulgarian Patriarch Daniel, referring to him as our Patriarch. Fanar representatives considered this a violation, as the community in Istanbul formally falls under the Omophorion of the Constantinopolitan Patriarchate. According to Pravblog, Bishop Isaac's stance provoked harsh criticism from pro-Fanar media, with publications accusing the Bulgarian delegation of provoking a scandal, disrespecting the traditions of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, and liturgical illiteracy. The publications emphasized that the presence of non-Orthodox at Vespers is not a canonical violation, but expresses brotherly joy, and called on Constantinople to ban Bishop Isaac from future visits to Turkey. However, Pravblog did not identify any specific sources for these criticisms. So, Axios to Bishop Isaac, the Bulgarian church continues to get better and better. Amazing patriarch, amazing vicars of their specific metropolia. So, Axios, again, great to see this from the Bulgarians. But we have a development in the Metropolitan Tychikos case as well. The headline here from the UOJ: Legal team of Metropolitan Tychikos alleges economic and political conspiracy behind removal. Claims center on $9.3 million in municipal debt, disputed financial audits, and alleged political pressure involving church and local officials. It says here, the removal of Metropolitan Tychikos of Paphos is developing into a broader institutional and legal dispute, with his legal team alleging that his dethronement was driven not by ecclesiastical misconduct, but by an economic and political conspiracy involving senior church and municipal figures. This was reported by UOJ Greece. And these are statements coming from Ireneos Antonios Giacomakis, which is one of Metropolitan Tychikos' lawyers. It says the case now extends beyond ecclesiastical jurisdiction and may fall within the scope of criminal investigation. A key element in the allegations is written in the testimony of the acting mayor of Paphos to police, which reportedly describes what the legal team calls an orchestrated operation beginning in the summer of 2024. According to the claims, Archbishop Georgios of Cyprus allegedly instructed then Mayor Phaedon Phaedonos to make public accusations against Metropolitan Tychikos in order to portray him as ineffective and facilitate his eventual removal by the synod on May 2025. The Metropolitan's legal team also points to a final court ruling requiring the municipality of Paphos to pay $8 million to the metropolis for land use. Tychikos had reportedly pressed for repayment, creating tensions with municipal authorities. In addition, the Metropolitan ordered a detailed financial audit of major agreements involving companies such as Pafilia, Mintis Hills, and the St. George Hotel. His legal counsel alleges that he faced pressure to halt the audit because it could expose financial dealings involving both church officials and the Archbishop. The allegations also include a political dimension, with claims of a common interest between Archbishop Georgios and the former mayor. According to the legal team, support for the mayor's presidential ambitions was allegedly tied to efforts to politically remove the Metropolitan. The legal team says it intends to pursue the matter through the civil courts, citing conspiracy to commit criminal offenses, defamation, abuse of power, and the concealment of financial scandals. The only way out is justice, Giacomakis said, arguing the accusations of ecclesiastical wrongdoing were used as a pretext to conceal financial misconduct. Metropolitan Tychikos remains in Paphos and, according to his representatives, continues to stand with the faithful while awaiting legal vindication and a full review of the circumstances surrounding his removal. Previously, the UOJ reported that the Church of Cyprus said the case of Metropolitan Tychikos is closed. Well, we hope that all justice can be served. I'm a big fan and personal acquaintance of Metropolitan Tychikos. He was very hospitable to me when I was in Cyprus, and I'll probably speak to Father Peter about potentially making even maybe a standalone video or writing an article or something about what happened to us. But the reason I believe this story from the UOJ and the accusations of the lawyers is that Father Peter and I were very much the victims of gangster-like, very strange, criminal-like activity, likely at the hands of the Archbishop and his goons, potentially working with local political corrupt officials like this mayor or something like that. And I will go into more detail, hopefully in the future. I want to ask Father Peter for his blessing to tell the story, because he's told me to hold off in the past, especially as Metropolitan Tychikos has been persecuted, didn't want to throw any kinks in there. But now that Father Peter's ecclesiastical situation is resolved, and this has now moved to the civil courts, and this kind of weird stalking-esque criminal behavior might become more relevant, I think it might be time to tell the tale. I've told people in my personal life, obviously, but stay tuned. And hopefully I can tell that story because it's very interesting. But that's the last bit of church news I have, Dimitri. I don't know if you have any other stories, but I'd love your final thoughts on what I just recounted and any final words you have for this week's World War III analysis.
No, of course, it's absolutely important for us to support the Metropolitan in his fight for essentially not just ecclesiastical justice, but I think definitely some of his civil rights were impinged and infringed upon by these, as you said, maybe not quasi-criminal authorities, but definitely gangster-like. And who knows, like the real truth really does need to come out. And we don't want to have, this history of various bishops and cross-diocese issues taking place and abuse going back to the early Byzantine Roman period when you had heretical bishops doing all kinds of nonsense. So let's just not be too surprised that there is well and truly drama even in the Eastern Mediterranean, right, on the island of Cyprus, where a lot of this stuff has happened before in the past between different competing groups. But it's just incredibly sad, especially during a time when not only was Cyprus even potentially struck, but it's going to be at the center of these future prophetic events. And yet it's some of those bishops of the island are well and truly, perpetuating what appears to be a very NATO-like, maybe even, I don't know, pro-Western agenda. I don't want to say pro-Israeli too soon, but who knows where exactly a lot of these strings lead, because Cyprus is, of course, a tax haven for many, many very devious and malicious groups around the world. There's all kinds of dark interests on that particular island, I would say polluting a very ancient Orthodox Christian land. So thank you for that analysis, Conrad. I think it's very, very timely.
Now, Metropolitan Tychikos is a diamond in the rough. Obviously Cyprus, it's sort of there's peaks and valleys. You've got absolute heroes like Metropolitan Neophytos, who I would argue is probably the greatest living hierarch, at least non-retired hierarch. You have Metropolitan Tychikos, who represented, I think, the tip of the spear of the new generation, the new crew of the ship that Saint Porphyrios talked about taking over to rule the church. And unfortunately, bureaucratic institutionalism and the corruption within the Greek governmental system and the EP stranglehold on all of the Greek churches and the diaspora around the world led to someone like Archbishop Georgios being able to remove Metropolitan Tychikos, silence, and try to relegate Metropolitan Neophytos, and effectively bully the other solid bishops like Metropolitan Athanasios of Limassol, Metropolitan Isaiah of Tomassos, and Metropolitan Nikephoros of Kikos, who are all also solid hierarchs in their own right, bully them into submission as well. So how you could have a church where five, minimum of five, if not more, so a solid half of the bishops are solid, don't support the schismatics, solid non-ecumenists, through the institutions that have been put in place in government church corruption. Again, whether it's the EP, the government in Greece, the government in Cyprus, these local city governments. Of course, they called in the Archbishop Makarios from Australia to conduct the investigation into Tychikos. And this whole same thing happened to Bishop Emilianos in Australia, who has, been persecuted by the EP, and his replacement then persecuted Tychikos. So it's all rotten to the core. And either Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew is going to repose sometime soon in his old age, and we'll get someone even worse, and this will accelerate, or by the grace of God, perhaps Metropolitan Stephanos, one of these other few candidates that could turn this around, gets in, and we see things kind of return back to normal, and this schism and the other major problems with ecumenism and other nonsense are resolved. So pray for the church, pray for those persecuted in Ukraine, pray for the abbot of Svyatogorsk monastery, of course, as he is still under house arrest, and all the other persecuted Christians, like I said, in Syria, in Lebanon, in the West Bank, in Palestine, and around the world. And those, of course, about to undergo more bombardment, likely in Iran when that gets kicked off again. But I want to encourage everybody to like the episode and share if this is important information to you, if you have friends or family that you think would like to be more informed and break free from the mainstream media, or even, some of the mainstream alt media that refuses to really name the perpetrators or invoke the interpretations, understanding of the church. Many of these people are far too secular, I think, for how late in the game we're really working here. So share things with your friends, whether you're listening on YouTube, Substack, X, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Hit us with a like, leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. I try to respond from the comments across the platforms. But again, worldwarnow.co, that's our Substack, that's our home base. That's where you can do the number one thing to support the show, which is get behind the paywall, become a monthly supporter. You can also save a bit of money by paying by year. I think it ends up saving you almost $1 a month. So do that, get behind the paywall, get access to all of our paid Ether Hour episodes. It's a weekly episode that you get. So every week, a new paid show that the majority of it will only be accessible by you. We also have monthly Q&A threads where you can ask questions to be answered in a long form in an Ether Hour episode by Dimitri and I. You also get access to premium Discord chats within our Discord server that Dimitri and I are more active in. So check all of that out. But again, get behind the paywall. You can check out episodes like our recent Ether Hour interview with former Lebanese Defense Minister Yaqub Saraf, all about the invasion of Lebanon, the ceasefire there. We go deep on Turkey and Syria and his perspective on all of that, and St. Paisios' prophecies about the Russo-Turkish War, among several other things, the retaking of Constantinople by Russia and Greece. So really, really fascinating stuff. Nothing like that exists, I think, on any other podcast. Are you going to find us interviewing Levantine politicians about the Orthodox prophecies? So if this is analysis that you like, please get behind the paywall and support the show. If you're already behind the paywall, or you want to just support us with a one-time donation, visit the Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/World War Now. A lot of great supporters are on there. Again, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, World War Now. It should come right up. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, give us 5 stars on there. Share us on there with your more normie podcast listening acquaintances, because it's a very easy way to listen. Follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. Great way to find us and keep up with the news 24/7. Be sure to follow us on X at World War Now _ Follow me on X at GnomeRad. Be sure to follow our Clips channels account as well on X at WWN Clips, or the World War Now Clips channel on YouTube, run by some great fans. So be sure to find those and share the clips around. Sharing and creating clips is one of the best ways to support the show. So please share the clips. Mention our name in the comments of your favorite podcast when they're looking for guests or looking for content to react to. That really helps us as well. Be sure to tune in every Tuesday evening, 7:45 p.m. Central Time, 8:45 p.m. Eastern. I go live for the World War Live show, where I answer questions and super chats and react to the latest news of the day and do more World War Now tier analysis. So thank you all so much for tuning in and making it to the end of this episode. I hope you all enjoyed. Leave a comment to let us know what you thought, and we will see you on the next one. God bless.